Great. Ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome back after lunch. Hopefully we haven't lost too many participants to the sandwich carts of Queen's University Belfast. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today's conference, Professor Eunan. Most of you in the room will know Eunan already, but Eunan is Professor Emeritus of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity College Dublin, and his most recent works, and we're not going to go through all his works, but his most recent and notable works, particularly in relation to today's topic, include Kevin Barry, An Irish Rebel, Life and Death, 2020, The Dead of the Irish Revolution, with our previous speaker, Noel Carolan, and he's currently completing research on An Island at War, Ireland 1922 to 23, which, as I can discern from the title, is very much the topic of today's keynote, that he's going to compare the violence in 22 and 23 on an island-wide basis. So I don't think it needs any more introduction than that. And Eunan, please.
Okay, thanks, Conor. And do, after half an hour, wake up and give me a loud signal. I must thank University of Ireland for inviting me, and Queen's University, obviously, for this terrific venue. I particularly thank Tricia. I described her as a saint in dealing with people like me, but in fact most saints are in heaven, rather than she's still in purgatory. But anyway, she and her colleagues have been terrific, so thanks to them. I'm sorry Kieran O'Hogarty, my friend and former colleague in DCU Business School many years ago, isn't here as the head, speaking on behalf of, as the head of Irish universities and so on, because I would take the opportunity, although it's not part of the 26 county issues, to comment on the deplorable way in which academics are being treated in the UK university system, and I think particularly early career academics, in terms of income, in terms of pension, and in terms of job insecurity. Now, in job insecurity, I think the situation is almost equally as bad across the border, but because essentially of the Constitution, they haven't been able to attack in the same way the pensions of people actually in service. I'm told, in fact, the government contemplated during the big financial crisis, in other words, of people in services, actual pensions expectations being changed, but they couldn't do that. But they could give people less pension rights after a certain date, which is bad enough. And when you think of the language of the Irish, the heads of Irish University have recently stepped forward and made a strong case for PhD students to be better funded. They couch that case entirely in terms of STEM, right? These are the only people that matter. And of course, in my time as a supervisor in DCU, but particularly with DCU, we had money because of the business school, but in Trinity, most humanities PhD students I knew, including people who became academics, they were either partly or entirely funded by themselves or their parents, because they're humanities. And it is appalling that Kieran and his colleagues would focus entirely in terms of improving research student stipends and postdoc stipends on STEM, as though there either is no other quality research being done, for example, the social sciences and humanities, who needs them, or if people do them, regrettably, they can do them on weird little semi-funded college bursaries are simply under their own steam. But I couldn't say that to Kieran because he isn't here, so I'm saying it to you instead. And also, can I finally express, for what it's worth, my horror that in the UK generally, staff are again being forced to withdraw their labour in what I'm sure will be, sadly, a pretty futile attempt to achieve some mitigation of the attack on their career prospects, their incomes, and so on. Okay, I can sit down now, I hope. The general idea of what I'm talking about is expressed in my title. Now, I was going to mention work, for example, Robert Lynch, obviously, Shifra, who's here, John Doherty, and many other people, Kieran Glennon, Belfast, because to some extent with some of the today's speakers, I felt not so much that they've stolen my arguments, but they've repossessed them. In other words, I was going to make arguments which are already, to all of us, patently obvious, which is that the sort of traditional divide, even within independent Ireland, if you like, of the narrative of violence and the way public commemoration has been structured and the way the media has historically treated it, as this curious thing where the train stops at the truce, it then jumps forward to the treaty, and then it jumps forward to the 28th of June 1922, when at 4 a.m. a referee blew a whistle, the first ball was kicked, or rather the first shell was fired in the Irish Civil War. And that sort of traditional approach we still have to try to get over in terms of public perception, not least because, as we hardly need to say it, here in Belfast, by most international metrics, and if we think in terms of civil war nowadays, one of the characteristics of civil wars, or wars of disaggregation, or whatever different ways you call it, is not the number of military who die, but the number of civilians. And by far the largest number of civilians who die in 1922 and 23. They don't die in our civil war. My guess, does anybody have a good figure for civilians not in the Civil War, but in 1922 and 1923 in the 26 counties who are deliberately killed? I haven't a clue. Does it reach 100? I'm not sure. And then you look not even in the 6 counties, if I use that term, but in Belfast itself, we had the figures this morning. They're horrendous. Furthermore, in Belfast, a characteristic, back to Linda's sort of particular area of interest, in Belfast, I think almost without exception, although I'll give you 1 or 2 examples, before and in the Civil War down south, right, females die not simply by accident, but they are legitimate targets to some degree. In terms of sectarian killing, and that's both in terms of, in a sense, just shooting anybody moving in the other lot's street, as it were, but it's also sometimes in reprisals, in reprisal killings. I'm thinking particularly, it's in April 22, off the Crumlin Road or wherever, where 2 women are shot because a special had been shot the previous day, and the husbands aren't available to be shot, so they shoot the 2 women. So it's in some ways, in terms of contemporary civil wars and contemporary ethnic conflict and so on, and you can argue about whether I'm conflating those terms or not, Northern Ireland looks far more like what we now think of in terms of, you can call it, but I would call it civil war, but also that civil war was itself a subset of and related to the political violence experienced in the newly partitioned 26 counties. But again, you've all said this before, and you've done a lot more work on it, so thanks for giving me the ideas, but I wanted to say them first, but you beat me to it. And we've mentioned the day of the Irish Revolution, which I did over many years, which has many limitations, one of which is what we're looking at is death as an index of violence, death as an index of political unrest, and death as an index of, in a sense, implicitly of suffering. Right? Isn't that right? And this is a very imperfect index. And again, I'll wander into Linda's territory on this again. Death is not the whole story, as it were, of the impact upon a society or societies, upon groups, upon clans, upon families, upon factions. It is not remotely. It just can't explain, does not encapsulate the experience of not only those who die, but more importantly, but those who are left, and it doesn't encapsulate the experience of the perpetrators, right? But also of victims, and especially victims' families and associates. And I do think one of the difficulties, and again, it's already been said here, one of the difficulties of the incredible profusion of sources, which to some extent I and other colleagues lobbied particularly for example, the Bureau of Military History, 1,773 witness statements and associated correspondence, which people often don't look at, and the Military Service Pensions Collection, which in 2006 I wrote a huffy op-ed thing in the Sunday Business Post around Easter Sunday or whatever, saying this is outrageous. There are 17,000 files relating to military service pensions. They're amazing because I had been leaked a few of them. They include transcripts, extraordinary levels of detail, and they were never meant for publication, so they're much more, in some ways, much more frank. Whereas I was completely wrong. There are over 300,000 files, and they're fantastic. But the problem is, how do we, if we're learning so much, in a sense, about activists, we're learning more and more about your granny, my grandfather, whoever it happens to be, who were active and who are relatives of the dependents of the dead. Right? We're learning almost nothing other than, to some extent, who shot Mr. Smith, or Miss Jones. We're learning about most of the population on the island who experience, and we're very often at the other end of political violence. I think that's a real problem for us. And again, I think what Morris was doing and some of the people he spoke to, one of the big pluses is that they aren't the Brewers, or even, in my case, descendant of the Maloneys or the Barrys or whoever, but that they're the sense of ordinary people in whom death was not in some ways a feature. A dead relative puts you in, as I use the phrase somewhere, of the minor aristocracy of the Republican movement, but where death was something of oh yeah, well, there was a great uncle or whatever, and he was killed, we don't know why or where, and God love him. And my mother never spoke about him, and so on, right? So in terms of the sort of touch towards a people's history, if you like, I think it is, in some ways these sources are brilliant, but they also take us further down the rabbit hole of looking at activists. Do you see what I mean? So and that's where, obviously, the more that the children and grandchildren or associates or whatever, descendants of people who aren't famous, right, and who perhaps didn't even get killed, like most females didn't get killed, as Linda's doing, but they're the ones with whom we should hope we can engage and so on. Anyway, okay. Yeah, well, that touches on the other book I did, called Kevin Barry, which is sort of an unfortunate work, not of family piety exactly, but it was a book which I was originally writing with a second cousin of mine, Shifra O'Donovan. Like me, she's a grandniece of Kevin Barry. She's also the granddaughter of one of the more interesting, if you like, Republican intellectuals, who in some ways hasn't, I think, yet received his due analysis publicly, which is a man called Jim Donovan, or Seamus O'Donovan, who was an IRA chemicals expert and so on, and had a very interesting, if not rather flawed, career and pedigree in the 1930s. But anyway, we each wrote books about Kevin Barry in the end, because we had very different approaches. And I have a lot of family material in that. But also I have the problem, Linda mentioned to me earlier, she wished I met my grandmother. I should, of course, have said, which one? My other granny, because writing this book made me think about my northern relatives. My other granny got married at 18 on the 22nd of June 1922. She and her husband, who was an IRA officer, left the north, right, for practical reasons, that he was going to be lifted. She had, barring my dad, who was born, she went back to have him at home, a country girl, a farmer's daughter, an absent farmer's daughter. The 10th of 10. She has 13 children in 18 years in about 6 different places in Ireland. Only once the first child back at her home, surrounded by her mother and her sisters and so on. All the other kids are born because my grandfather ends up, as did many active Republicans, working for the Free State as a Garda sergeant. And so she had to, can you imagine I would think that for most of the time of her husband's life, he died when she was 38, she was breastfeeding. She was pregnant and/or breastfeeding, because she had a few miscarriages. So if you're looking at whether it's a family thing, but a gender issue or other, of people who really suffer from, for example, from forced migration, if we call it that, you only have to look at people, irrespective of denomination, of men who have to leave their work or whatever, find work somewhere safer. You don't only have to look at Republicans who are discriminated against in the Free State. I have my doubts about that. The extent of that, is Cormac O'Malley here? I was at a seminar in UCD sitting at the back about civil wars, and Cormac was there, and he made a comment towards the end from the audience about how terrible it was, for Republicans after the Civil War ends. They all had to emigrate. I didn't want to say anything, but I couldn't. I had to stay. I said, Cormac, your father got out of jail and he went back to UCD. My great uncle, Con Maloney, Deputy Chief of Staff, captured in March 23. When does he get out? Christmas 23, before my grandfather. And by early 24, he has a job as a county council rate collector, which is a political job, which unfortunately he messed up. So the idea that certainly at the elite level, everybody had to leave. Ernie left, not because he was forced out by the Free State, but because he got fed up with medicine, because he really was shattered by his experiences in the War of Independence and Civil War, not only by his wounds, but by what he had seen and by what he had done. But he emigrated not because he had no future, but because he wanted to get out. Todd Andrews, who writes about this kind of stuff, of course, Andrews, whom I knew, what did Todd Andrews do? Dr. Todd Andrews from this university, his doctorate from here, he was very proud of it. Todd, when he got it, he went back to UCD, continued to play the foreign game of soccer, and found himself a job, and the rest, as it were, in history. So, anyway, I don't know how I got there. Okay, so my argument is partly picking up on the dead, but also more generally. And you can call this a civil conflict, not civil war. But as I say, in a conflict which in Belfast and in other parts of the north, a lot of people die. And yet in British terms, I was just thinking of an analogy. Is there any awareness in Britain of the violence in Belfast in 1922? Any contemporary awareness whatsoever, except as a kind of a retrospective footnote to the Troubles? I say there's none. There's more, I think, say of people of my age and kind of general reading. More people probably know about the Scarborough Raid. You know about the Scarborough Raid in 1914? And Harrogate as well. They were shelled by the German Grand Fleet. It was pretty exciting. There were less than 100 people killed, but it is a kind of a minor headline in terms of the home front of the First World War. But there's no home fronty thing that takes part of the United Kingdom, i.e. Northern Ireland, and reflects and marks that at all, even though the deaths were, in a sense, so much greater, although it wasn't the Germans doing it. Or the French were the main people to blame. I read the Daily Telegraph, and that's one valuable thing I've learned from that. But for example, I heard about the 6th of January 1922, a man called Peter Switzer, his death cert says he's 75 actually, is attending his sister's funeral in Limerick, in County Limerick. And as he's driving by towards or away from, I'm not sure, towards the church, he's a bachelor Protestant farmer. He's shot at and gets wounded. In fact, he dies the next day. Now, that is a killing clearly of retaliation, because in 1920 his farm had been raided by the IRA looking for weapons. He fought with one of them and shot him. And I assume that's why somebody will go and kill him. Now, that's a kind of a just desserts argument would have been the argument of the people who killed him, even though it was obviously an elderly man. And going to a funeral, it's pretty severe. Then a man called Frank Kelly, who's a middle-aged farmer. I just picked these at random. Is dragged out by unknown men, presumably local specials in plain clothes, and he's shot dead. He's one of a number killed in part of Tyrone that time. Again, in April 22, and I know about this chap, simply Michael Sweeney, because the son of a woman who was in love with him but who refused to get engaged to him because he didn't want any connection with violence, and who the rest of her days carried his memory in her heart. This man approached me with all this kind of material and showed it to me. But he's killed allegedly while trying to escape from a lorry in Grafton Street. He's an anti-treaty IRA man. It's pre-Civil War, but he gets killed anyway and gets an enormous funeral. Again, in early May, I don't know the date, a 9-year-old girl who, I'm afraid I've forgotten her name, gets killed in crossfire between National Army troops and the anti-treaty IRA. So before the Civil War, as we know, the two sides are fighting, and not just fighting anonymously, they're fighting under their respective colours. Again, obviously here in Belfast in May, 22nd of May 1922, a Unionist MP is shot dead, Twaddle, who's particularly associated with the Imperial Guard, whatever. He's a man in his late 30s with a family and so on. A visiting English ecumenist who constantly travelled between north and south. Rosamund Stephen writes to her sister about how she's talking to the wife of the Church of Ireland, a very liberal Church of Ireland minister, and the woman is almost, she says, she has almost collapsed in expressing this extreme hatred of RCs, Roman Catholics, despite the fact that her husband was seen very much as a liberal. And then it turns out it's because she knew the Trottle family because they worshipped in his church, in All Saints Church, I think it was. And so on. And just finally to mention Margaret Livingston, who's a 13-year-old girl, again, from a Church of Ireland family. Her father's a postmaster, and for the third time his premises in Balmore in Cavan is raided by Republicans looking for arms. Now they had raided before. He does have a weapon left, which may have been a shotgun, which, as we know, shotguns were just part of the furniture in rural Ireland. They could be used, but very inefficiently usually in terms of political violence. But the father hands out a gun, and then, for some reason, the IRA opened fire, shooting. They may not have realised it was a girl. She was looking out the window. They shoot the top of her head off. Now, an interesting thing there is you would think, and I took it for granted almost, that, well, that'll be the end of the Livingstons in that area. But despite a boycott which is subsequently put on their premises, according to the Anglo-Celt of June this year, the Livingstons are still in the area, which is an interesting contra thing of the idea of, after such an extreme event of such a loss, that you would get the message, as it were, and leave. In some ways, it's heartening, and so on. So I don't see this kind of violence as being very much different, if at all, than what we see for most of the Civil War. Most of the Civil War in the South, after, with the possible exception of Kilmallock, it looks more like insurrection and counterinsurgency to me than it does like, people wearing blue uniforms and grey uniforms, which is the other Civil War that ever happened, the American Civil War, pounding each other to death on a battlefield, right? I think there are interesting dimensions of the Civil War in a military sense. I'll touch on this later. Jesus. How long have I been going on for? 10 minutes. What? 10 minutes left. Left? Yeah. But I haven't started. Okay. There are military aspects of the Civil War which are really important. I've spoken to many times in the Curragh to different groups of young officers and middle-ranking officers training the Irish Military College and on senior courses. They've never, to this day, studied formally the Civil War, even though it was the one war that the National Army won, and they won it not simply by force of weight of numbers. At the time the Civil War broke out, there were more anti-treatyites mobilised than there was a National Army. They didn't win it simply because the British supported them with weapons and with wireless support and things as I'll touch on. They won it because they had staff officers who thought systematically, how are we going to win, how are we going to do this fight, and how are we going to win? And they won, I say, not just by numbers and their numbers grew as the intensity of the fighting diminished, right? But they did it particularly by using ships to move people around the coast, which came with a thunderbolt to the anti-treatyites, who never ever came up with a solution to this conundrum, and they did it by being organised and by command and control. But just before that, I'll just briefly, because I'm stuck by the sequence. When I was young, in the 60s and 70s, right, commemorations were almost always belonged to the anti-treaty side and their, and their, as it were, descendants and so on. A lot of them were still alive, and I would have seen a lot of it as because of my family, because I was the only one who took an interest in these exercises. That's the detail from the Ballyseedy Memorial outside Killarney. Was it Killarney? God, getting mixed up now. Which is one of many monuments, some elegant, some not, many quite decrepit, but not nearly as decrepit as others across the state and across the country. A lot of these, the more decrepit ones, have since been kind of made over because of the centenary. You use an example here of a man called Hunt. I think his first name was Michael, who in November 1922 was pulled out of his farmhouse in Sligo and shot dead. He's allegedly a spy. He's got 10 children. He's a small farmer and a poultry vendor or something, so there's not a lot of money here. What happened to his wife, who's just back from hospital, and her 10 children, right? Has anyone ever, for all I know they have, explored their histories? And did they know about, do the descendants know about Hunt? Are they still embarrassed because the taint of informer still has a strong cultural resonance, certainly in Irish nationalism? I'll give you an example. Last Wednesday I had a former sergeant of the Irish Guards talking about his experience as an Irish soldier in the British Army in the 1960s and 70s. He was on an operation in Aden where they were on a landing ship, really, doing a raid near, and it was Irish Guards, and the OC said to them, look, you see 6 men here in disguise, and they put on hoods later on, hooded men. These are informers. These are the people who know the local people that we have to take out, right? Who are actually going to fight us. They were they were infiltrators from across the border. And in fact, the guys, my friend didn't see a shot fired because by the time the main body had landed, the quote terrorists had been identified by these informers wearing hoods and killed. But the thing is, most of Jim's Irish Guards, they were asked to be nice to these guys, were appalled. And they said, we can't talk to them. I won't use the language. Informers, right? So it shows you the power. And even though Jim would say, why not? But these people are going to help us. They're going to save our lives. No, they're informers. They're beneath the salt or whatever. But I wonder what happened to the Hunt family. Are they remembered? Do they commemorate their dead grandfather, great-grandfather? Or do they try to forget it, partly because the taint would still be with them? And also they were so poor, I would guess, most of them emigrated. And then you have now, quite recently, perhaps it's becoming above ground in the public way, the way that Antony in particular, obviously Frank Aiken's associated with that, has become a sort of a headline memory for Unionists, right? And again, we mustn't forget that Antony was not the only occasion on which border Protestants suffered what, the equivalent of what border nationalists or border Republican families suffered. And yet it somehow seems almost odd that anyone would bring Antony up, because it's not part, typically it seems to me within Unionist memory, there hasn't been the same focus. Do you see what I mean? On, as it were, atrocities by the other side. Certainly at an individual or familial level, it's nearly all done at a communal level. Now, just very quickly, I'll show you 2 documents here, but if you want to know why the Civil War was won and lost, don't simply say because the British supported the pro-treaty side. You're a young audience, but you're not too young to remember 2010 in Iraq, right? Where an army trained, equipped and so on, and supported by just astonishing amounts, trillions of American dollars, disappeared in a puff of smoke when ISIS attacked, right? Okay, because they didn't have the will. Those of you who are too young to remember 2010, you surely remember last year in Afghanistan, where a vast national police and military apparatus, again supported to an extraordinary degree by equipment, by technology, by American mentors and so on, disappears, crumbles, right? So it's not just equipment and foreign sponsorship that helps you win. It's an element of your own professionalism and organisation, and also your determination, and probably quite a lot of support from the general public. But just to be back to here, just to explain, the document here on the left is from Liam Lynch, Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA, who was then writing from Dublin. The dates are hard to read, but that's not my fault. It was originally typed letter dated the 28th of January 1923, and he's writing to Sligo, to Frank Carty, the IRA commander there, and he's congratulating him essentially on what he'd done up to the 30th of November. So it's taken about 2 months for Lynch to respond and so on, and to exhort him to further action. And by contrast, this is from a file on Liam Deasy, Deputy Chief of Staff until he was captured and identified, put on trial, court-martialed and sentenced to death in Clonmel in January 23. And I don't know if you can see the dates there, the timing there properly. This wasn't sent, this isn't a communication which took two months to arrive. And don't forget, anti-IRA communications were mainly, well, those that weren't even handwritten, were typed. They were handed typically to a young woman who would cycle to the nearest railway station if there was a friendly guard and if the IRA hadn't blown up the line. The document would be smuggled up. It could take 2 weeks sometimes to arrive. Dublin and Waterford are talking about DC's fate, not quite on the telephone, but they're talking by military wireless, and it's a matter of hours. So you have command and control, which you had never had in the War of Independence on the pro-government side. And equally, with the same reservations, if you look at it in Northern Ireland, the point is the specials were not only nasty, horrible people or brave defenders of Ulster, depending on who you read, but they were also, to some extent, capable of central direction and reportage because they used an instrument, the wireless. And you can say, oh, well, those poor old Republicans. Republicans had 6 months to prepare for this war, right? They had 6 months where they were going to, most of those who took the anti-treaty side, perhaps not Cathal Brugha, but more militant people, including James O'Donovan, who was in the Army Council, or the IRA executive, were saying we're really going to end up having a fight. And so they get weapons from abroad and so on. But they prepare for a rerun of the War of Independence. They don't prepare for a war in which you won't just take a symbolic building. 1916 had shown the limitations of that, but where you will attempt to gain territory and hold it, right? But other Irishmen on the pro-treaty side gave that some thought, and that's why, and yet our Irish military don't study that. They do study the American Civil War, which is, Gettysburg, Antietam, or whatever, are of interest to military history buffs, but they aren't necessarily be likely of great professional use to a very small military. Anyway, I'll just briefly, how long more, Your Honour?
We have a few minutes.
Okay. Right, well, I'll stop at the 10 minutes, I promise. Just to mention, Northern Republicans and the Civil War, I touched on this earlier in a sense, and I commented on one of my many grandmothers. You take the case there of Alice Mallon, who's been written about, Alice McSloyne as she was, already by other people. But there's an example of where somebody who was or wasn't, she was considered to be the brains of the IRA in Cookstown, at least by the local specials. The police thought she was just a silly, bitter girl. I'm just quoting a police file. But she's interned with Siofra's great-aunt or great-great-aunt in Armagh for a time. And she gets out, but this isn't really a gender point, but in some ways it is. When she gets out, she's served with effectively an exclusion order. She can live in her home about 5 miles outside Cookstown, but she can't go into Cookstown. Now, in Cookstown, she had been a typist, right? Which for a young woman at the time means you've got a transferable skill, you can be independent, you can move around, right? Because men couldn't type. It was beneath them, but also probably too difficult. And so she's deprived of the ability to carry out, to do a job which gave her, by the standards of the time, for a young woman, unless she wanted to be a shop assistant, gave her some prospect. Do you see what I mean? Of having an independent life, and instead she goes home, although she comes south, she ends up going home to look after her aged relatives. So I think it's an interesting example of how exclusion orders, post-release, had a different kind of impact. Perhaps for some people than for others. And also, as both north and south, you have internment. But in the south, you don't have the equivalent. You don't have post-internment conditions whatsoever. So the other one, the right man called Dan Rice, my granny's brother Dan from County Down, he comes north in 23, because he turns out to be about an eighth of an inch too short to become a civic guard. He'd been an IRA officer in the Corps, like lots of them, didn't want to be in the Civil War. He's interned in February 23. When does he get out of jail? Or out of internment? He gets out of jail in December 24, long after any anti-treatyite, however bloody his hands, however much hated, has been released in the south. So you both sides both jurisdictions using internment really successfully. There was a time when it worked, folks, but you have very, very different approaches to post-release and so on. Now, there is an argument in terms of human capital where I haven't touched on Protestant migration and all that sort of thing, or unionists, and all that kind of thing. But just to mention, this is from the O'Kane papers, which some of you know in Armagh. It's a fantastic collection. But there's a photograph there of people, two of whom are prominent IRA officers in County Derry, and they come south. I think you probably know who they are. That angular face with the if you take the hat off, it's Johnny Haughey. They say apparently a mad Republican, but yet he comes south, ends up in the Free State Army because that's going to, conquer the north, which doesn't happen. And we know Johnny Haughey, amongst other gifts to Ireland, gave him his son. And I can say his son gave me a gift 2 years ago. Where is it? Somewhere here. Which means that universities in Ireland aren't paying for my train ticket because once I reach the age of 66, thanks to Haughey in 69, pensioners are given free travel. And the man on the right, Dan McKenna, who again, Haughey's commanding officer, who ends up as an outstanding Chief of Staff of the Army during the emergency of the Second World War, but who in 1925 writes an absolutely vitriolic critique of Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy's Northern Strategy in the first months of 1922. And this is on his file his officer's file, which I was given permission to look at. And he's of all the men who became Chief of Staff of the Army up to the 1980s, there's nothing, no one else's file has any extract from a document they ever wrote. So he obviously got into not of trouble, but he was marked out as a troublemaker. And what saved him, that he was outstandingly able. But he writes a very cogent thing. He said the result of this policy was he doesn't use the term, but pogrom, execution, the extermination of several Catholic families, and so on. It's a very forthright thing, so we were lucky to get him. Indefinite detention, well, I've touched on that. Just an example, this is a letter written by Jim O'Donovan, Seamus O'Donovan, and to his mother, which is smuggled out of prison, and which I came across 2 years ago in a relative's papers. But he's giving out, he's saying, there's not the remotest possibility of our resorting to armed force. So he says, why isn't the government releasing them? This is December 23, right? There's an expectation that once the fighting stops, or after a while, no matter what you've done, you get released. Because that is how it had worked since 1917, where the British government, for reasons which look bizarre, release progressively everybody who's been either convicted or interned after the rising. You either got executed or you let go within a year. And then they as you know, you had this cyclical thing then where people were then arrested in 1918, leading figures, including my great-grandfather, and then released and arrested again and so on. Whereas the British had an overwhelming argument after 1916 saying, sorry, we can't be sure, and you were allied with Germany, and when the war's over, we let you out. But they didn't. And so there's a cultural expectation, I think, in the north as well as in the south, that once things die down, you'll be let go. And in the end, Jim O'Donnell, in fact, only gets out in July 24. And again, by contrast, there's a postcard, one of those prison postcards sent from Larne by that man, my great-uncle Dan Rice, to my grandmother, Annie. And he's writing in December 24, saying, don't bother to send material. I asked about the text of a new Irish play, because the audience is now too small. People are being released. But the thing is, he gets out at that time in December 24. But if you look a year previously, I was just on Wednesday in Armagh, on Tuesday, looking at the papers of Rory, the cards of Rory Graham, a Belfast man. And you can see in 22, he thinks, oh, we'll be let out shortly, but I don't know when. 23, he'll be let out shortly, and I don't know when. So indefinite detention is this thing that hangs over prisoners in both jurisdictions. It's applied more in the north and in the south. And again, what consequence does that have, not only for the people who are detained, but for their families? That's just a photograph. Jim Maloney, my grandfather, left. Moss Toomey, later Chief Jaffa, and Jim O'Donovan. I went to see, talking of oral history and Morris's thing and memory, the first person I attempted, as I thought, to talk to in research terms, when I was finishing my degree, and I thought I'd do an MA on anti-Semitism in Dublin, I went to see Moss Toomey. He was an old friend of my grandparents. And Toomey could see straight away. He was I realised I was completely unprepared. And so, but he was kind, but he could see through me in a nice way, not in the way that an experienced headmaster can see through you. And on the way out, having talked to me about the IRA in the 20s and 30s and a bit about the more recent troubles that, of course, were still ongoing, he stopped and he lived on Nutley Road, which is a very swanky road in Donnybrook in Dublin. And he said, "You see that house over there?" I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "You know who lives there?" I said, "No." He said, "Oh, Jack Costello's daughter, John A. Costello, the former Fine Gael Taoiseach, the Attorney General in the 1920s, an absolute arch enemy, you would say. Jack Costello's daughter lives over there. She's a great friend of mine." And then he went indoors. And I still don't know why he told me that. But wasn't it interesting? And if you look at the attendance at Moss Toomey's funeral in '78, I went to it because my grandfather was too old. You find who goes to his funeral? Well, I saw Sean McStiffo and I saw various luminaries of the different IRAs and all the old crowd there. And some of those old ladies, you don't remember them? The Coming On ladies, when I met them, they all had fur coats and leather gloves, just as the old IRA men I met. I imagine them in ambushes wearing hats and coats, and sort of kind of slightly wobbly, because that's by the time I met them. Gareth Fitzgerald was at it, right? Who had been Minister for Foreign Affairs, son of Desmond, absolutely the other side of the Civil War. Nobody threw bricks at him. Okay, I'll just click on a bit. So that just makes me wonder about this theme of Civil War bitterness. What's interesting in Ireland, leaving aside the fact that the outcome for the losers was, in this jurisdiction, in the South and even here, was relative. The outcome was so limited. If you were a prisoner in Spain at the end of your Civil War, about 50,000 of you still got killed, right? Even in Finland, civilized Finland, there are hundreds of people tried and executed, and lots more, their civil rights are taken away after their Civil War. In both parts of Ireland, the consequences of being on the losing side, if you didn't die, for activists were very limited. But of course, I'm running away from the point that what we should be doing, and you people are doing much more research on it than I am, is the consequences for ordinary people, for unfamous people, for those who survive, but also of those who suffer. And just finally, Your Honour, I will finish now. To mention an example of the issue of trauma, again, which I've discovering trauma, PTSD and all that is very interesting. What's more interesting is again, as Linda is doing, is to look at how not necessarily the families of the famous or the families of the dead, but the families of ordinary people whose houses, particularly whose homes are invaded and so on, whether they're subject to sexual assault or not. My grandmother, Cathy Barry, briefly told us cheerfully about being arrested several times in the Civil War, but she was always released because she was a celebrity, she was well fed, and I remember I still have an image of a glass, of a green metal box of sweets. She said officers would bring her in boxes of sweets. These kind of, I was thinking, I still can't get the idea of these jellies out of my head. My other grandmother only told me jokingly about being a young woman when I asked her, her house being raided repeatedly when she was 15, 16, 17. But she told her daughter, her youngest daughter, who just told me a few years ago, the terror of being in a house of only of women, because the men are gone because they're on the run, and men bursting in repeatedly with weapons, not just tearing the place apart, but they're also looking at you as a teenage girl. And half of them were fellas she knew, because they're specials from the area. So different thing, that's another point. But anyway, this is the first page of an IRA officer's account of Charlie Dalton in 1920, because his wife writes this man in 1941, say, look, will you write in support of his application, a disability application? Because he was in and out of psychiatric hospitals. Now, Dalton, as we know, was associated with several terrible killings, but particularly the Red Cow killings of young men who were arrested in November 1922 and were found dead the next day outside Dublin. Dalton himself was about 18 at the time of Bloody Sunday, and this letter refers to his condition after the shootings of Bloody Sunday. But the man writing it said that even before Bloody Sunday, I thought he was too young for the work he was doing. Dalton was basically, his job was to follow people and report who they were and all that stuff. It's 4 pages, it's handwritten, right? And who's it written by? The Minister for Supply. Who's the Minister for Supply in 1941? Sean Lemass. And yet Sean Lemass's own brother Noel had been killed not by Charlie Dalton, but in the same way as the people Dalton probably killed just after the Civil War. Noel Lemass was murdered. And so you have a guy who's already the number 2 in Fianna Fáil, the embodiment of the anti-treaty political wing. He's writing by hand, fluently, and what he actually says that after Bloody Sunday, that evening, Dalton was so disturbed because of a dripping tap, and the sound reminded of a sound he'd heard that morning in a house where Lemass and others had shot a man, that he was just going mad. He and another volunteer had to take Dalton out and walk him around the streets, although there was a curfew. So I mean, that's a general extreme example, but I think there's a wider thing about Civil War bitterness, and I would say it's containment rather than its extent. And why? Because compared to Belfast in 22, there wasn't that much. So why is remembrance so uneven? Why do we still, if you want a monument, you go to Ballyseedy, in Manorhamilton there's a monument to Phil Gilgun. Anyone remember him? Well, he's anti-treaty, so of course there's a monument to him. The Hunts, and I should mention finally, I think this question was initially opened up by my colleague Anne Dolan's book commemorating the Irish Civil War. It continues to be an issue. At a conference recently, a serving army officer brought it up, Stephen McKeown. How come there's something over 1,000 people die in the National Army during the Civil War? I think about half by what the British Army used to call own goals. That's to say mainly accidental shootings and some traffic accidents, right? But nevertheless, they did die just as surely as about 400 IRA people die in the Civil War and immediately after. And it is remarkable how the army itself has never identified that or publicly stated about that. The officer who made this point was doing it in a personal capacity, not on behalf of the Defence Forces. So I applaud the way our discourse here shows how much work is being done, not only by historians, but by social scientists, if you like, and even by filmmakers, just extraordinary. But I think there's a way to go in the public imagination before we get any kind of serious recalibration of political violence in Ireland. Thank you.
Join us here. Thank you very much, Eunan. We have about 5 minutes for questions, I think, so we can stick to our timings. I'm going to get our good speaker mic'd up here, and we'll take the first question, which I see down there at the back. Yeah, there's a microphone coming to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eunan. Sorry I missed you at lunchtime. It's a mistake. One of the things, this is more a point of information, which is awful for me to let on, and I know more than anybody else, but the numbers killed in Belfast between the shipyard expulsions of July 1920 until the outbreak effectively of the Civil War a little bit after it in 1922, not coterminous with the rest of Ireland. Certainly more killing when there was a truce observed in most of Ireland. But the figures that Alan Parkinson and Kieran Glennon have arrived at separately are 499 people died violently. However, the huge number of non-combatants upon them is what I find compelling. 23 Republicans in Belfast, that's members of Sinn Féin, the IRA, Fianna. 16 RIC, I think it's 3 British Army, a couple of auxiliaries, 11 members of the Special Constabulary. Putting them all together, you've got a figure of civilian deaths, non-combatant deaths, accidental deaths, most of whom are nationalist, although I think it comes down to the amount of specials sort of involved, maybe. It actually comes down to something like 430 non-combatant deaths.
No, thank you. I mean, I wish I'd been the first to make that point about Northern Ireland generally. It's and especially Belfast, but you also get pre our Civil War. You get in Tyrone, for example, which had really been the sleepiest of hollows up to the December 21. You get in places. You get tit-for-tat killings and so on. We know obviously about Antony and Armagh, but it's not only in Derry. Now, the resonance, in Belfast is bigger, but in some ways, funny enough, I suspect it's almost as big in collective memory, in communal memory, in places where, in terms of a body count, very little happens, you know? But whereas in Belfast, there's so many civilians, we can't remember them, you know what I mean? If there's 2 or 3 people killed or 2 atrocities, well, we have the McMahon family in Belfast, yes, but there's so many more that they kind of get washed away, and with them goes the question of how did their families cope? How were these remembered or not remembered? Did their families suffer less than the families of celebrities, as it were, who died? So to the unfamous dead, especially civilian dead, do they not have a right to be thought about, you know? Anyway, thanks.
There's a question here at the...
This is less a question than just on a point of information. You were talking earlier on there about the repercussions for non-combatants after the Civil War. Several times this morning there was mention of the Clonus affray, which is something I've been particularly interested in, coming from where I do. But Matt Fitzpatrick, who was the commandant of the Free State forces who went to the station to challenge the thing, and was the first death. He was shot as he walked along the platform. And of course there were 4 specialists killed. Yeah. The train took off with the bodies on board. There were 3 taken for medical care in Clonus. The train went off. It stopped at Lisbon, and when the train pulled in with injured and wounded and dying on the thing, a riot began, and the riot spread right across what was becoming Northern Ireland. And within a week, 42 people had been killed. Yeah. All of them, I believe, civilians. Yeah. But an additional kind of point to this is that Matt Fitzpatrick and his 3 brothers had all been active in the Wattle Bridge division of the IRA. So they were in County Fermanagh.
That's right.
Yeah. His parents were burnt out of their home, their farm home, afterwards in a reprisal. One of the other brothers was killed. 2 were serving officers. And a solicitor from Clonus called Baldwin Murphy, whom I knew, wrote to the authorities in Dublin looking for a pension for Matt Fitzpatrick's mother. At that stage, she was living in Clonus, she was in the south, and whatever. She was refused the pension on the basis that her husband had received £100 ex gratia payment beforehand. And anyway, her address was now in Northern Ireland. Yeah. So she got another. She actually survived about 10 years in dire poverty. I think she was supported by the St. Vincent de Paul Society to the end. But it struck me then that, if they could do that to people on their own side, what were they capable of doing to those on the other side? But anyway, I just thought it was and quite given the repercussions for non-combatants,
Well, on the pensions thing, I've not read all of them, but I think I've read a good few individual pensions, and I think in some ways, because it's a bureaucratic process, I think by and large, at the administrative level, there's not particular prejudice, pro or anti. I was looking at Jim O'Donovan, Seamus O'Donovan's papers, and he's released in December 23. He goes on in the 30s to be the designer of the IRA's S-Plan bombing campaign in Britain, which characteristically he blames not the plan but the way it's carried out by Sean Russell's acolytes who didn't follow his instructions. He then becomes the link. He goes to Germany with my aunt, my great aunt Monty, his wife, as cover to set up a link with the Germans, right? And he's the man who sets up the intelligence link. They give him $20,000 and so on and so on and so on. And but he gets his first pension application in 34. The first referee he puts down is D. Mulcahy, or Richard Mulcahy, right? And you get constantly in those, and if you talk about why there's reconciliation across everybody, I needed. John V. Joyce might have been my commanding officer in 1920s, hated as the Hanger Joyce. He was in the military tribunals in the 30s, and in the 40s sentenced IRA men to death. But you could be as anti-treaty as you like, or anti-state. But but you want, J.V. Joyce would write for you. He'd say up to I can confirm that up to July 1921, Darren MacDonald was in my company. He attended all his parades and this and that and the other. And you get that constantly. Dick Mulcahy's wife, Min Mulcahy, there's somebody working on the Mulcahys. Look, she's in like a flash when Cumann Amon get the chance pensions under the Fianna Fáil Act. And her membership up to July 1921 of Cumann Amon is duly certified by the Cumann Amon Officer Board, most of whom not only are anti-treaty but don't recognise the state except for the purposes of getting some money. And you get that time and again, and not only with the famous, because at elite level, the point is people still, the Ryans being a prime example, but all over the place, in practice still interact and they get over it. But you wonder about the poor so-and-sos, who weren't important, who whatever, and whether they as quickly got access or not to pensions on the like. But the pensions files are really valuable, but again, they don't tell us about the civilians who suffered more, so to say, in Belfast, for example. As Jim had said, they don't tell us, and they don't give us an indication of the ramifications over generations of those deaths, spoken of or unspoken. Of course, Northern Ireland perhaps turned out such a success, maybe as a result. Anyway.
There's one other question. We'll take that question very quickly, and then we're going to just to keep the time.
Yeah, thank you. So my question would concern the generational aspects of collective violence, which you have spoken about quite a lot. So I would like to hear if you've come across anything that would indicate whether the levels of violence and things like tit-for-tat killings during the Civil War were influenced by previous experiences of collective violence, such as the agrarian violence, the various waves of agrarian violence during the 19th century, because that's an argument that has often been made, both in nationalist myth-making and in justifying state repression, such as in cases of South Armagh, where it's clearly a rather contrived argument. In some areas, I found it rather, other than that, I found it rather convincing. So I would like to hear what your take on that is, if there's been any influence, any patterns of transmission of collective violence from the earlier waves to the Civil War.
Well, I think it's more you've got to look at from 1920 on, where clearly in rural Ireland, yes, there's pockets, there's places that have always been difficult. That of Tipperary is an obvious example, where the land war undoubtedly has a generational knock-on effect, not just simply in terms of individual families, but in terms of memory of different kinds of struggle and semi-armed struggle, but also different kinds of violence and intimidation against the enemy and so on. I think that's the land war definitely is much more so than say the Fenians and that, which are kind of you drink to them and you sing the songs, and there's a Fenian tradition, but there is clearly a thing that's almost not political. I don't know if you agree, Conor, which is in a sense the land war in urban Ireland. Or in Belfast especially, but in Dublin, not so much in Cork. But what amazes me is that there's absolutely the kind of violence, and even up to December 21, there are relatively very few civilians killed as spies by the IRA in Dublin. It's about 5% of all deaths. In Cork, it's almost 15%. Right? And some of those killings clearly are to do with local antagonisms, which may be about socioeconomic issues, maybe about land. I have to say, Ed Burke, formerly of Nottingham, now in UCD, once a student of mine, but he's doing a lot of work. I think there's a book coming out on Belfast in 22, because he's doing it in a sense from the military angle. Yeah. And I think he's going to argue that some of the Belfast killings may have had commercial consequences, let's say, in the pub business, which suggests that so there may have been a bit of element of killing in order to appropriate. Just as in rural Ireland, if you kill, perhaps Peter Switzer may be an example. The farm is gone now, there's no one left. Switzer was a large farmer. I haven't checked what happened to his farm. So maybe it wasn't just about Dan Neville, whom he shot in defence, and maybe it's not just about him being a Protestant, but that he was probably a large landowner whose presence had been resented, since the dawn of time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eunan, and thanks to all our questioners for really provoking questions on that. So we will move on to the history blitz, I think, immediately. But it stands for me just to thank our keynote speaker, Eunan Halpin. Yeah, thank you. Well done, Eunan. That was great. I think you can leave that there. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well done.
Yes, we're going to move straight on to this session, a history blitz session, and I am really delighted, in my role as Secretary to Universities Ireland, to be chairing this particular session, because not only are these two speakers both from Dublin City University, but the reason that we're doing this is because they're also recipients of the Universities Ireland history bursaries. Universities Ireland has been supporting these bursaries now for nearly 10 years. It offers normally 2 bursaries per year, and we have here product of those that particular initiative. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce this session, and I'm going to hand straight over to Noel, who's going to give us a taste of exactly that research that he's been able to undertake as a result of one of those University Ireland history bursaries. So over to you, Noel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And I must start, first of all, by saying that I'm grateful really for the funding from Dublin City University and the Irish Research Council, but in particular to University Ireland for its bursary, its history bursary. So when we look, it's understandable really when we have a great tendency to associate subsistence crises in Ireland with the 19th century. Nonetheless, food supply crises in 1922 and 1925 challenged the capability and reputation of the Irish Free State during its opening years. These challenges are considered in this short paper, which also identifies how they were represented abroad and notes similarities with earlier food supply crises. Unionists and nationalists invariably disputed the gravity of the episodic food supply crisis which continued from the Great Famine until the 1920s. The crisis occurred along Ireland's western seaboard, Atlantic seaboard, and where there was a dependency on a potato subsistence diets, on economic small holdings, and on summertime labour migration. Their geographic distribution is well illustrated in this slide, which shows how outdoor relief more than doubled in many Western poor law unions during the 1898 food supply crisis. That food crisis produced the first photography of hunger in Ireland, and remarkably, photography also intensified the political response to the 1925 food shortage, the last episodic food shortage of the 20th century in Ireland. So in the spring of 1921, the Irish White Cross estimated that approximately 100,000 persons on the western seaboard faced starvation, although obviously the organisation was principally directing its efforts and financial aid at the War of Independence destruction. Despite the peaceful winter of 1921-2, the food supply worsened considerably. By August 1922, the Irish White Cross had allocated £20,000, quote, for the barest necessities of life, food, clothing, and seed. Now, as the Irish Independent Special Representative, toured Connemara and provided detailed reports under the headline, "Dread Story of Famine, Ghastly State in Connemara." It detailed living conditions and food supply shortages remarkably like those of 1898 and recounted how people in 1922 existed on, quote, 2 meals of potatoes that elsewhere would not be fed to pigs. In March 1922, Father John Godfrey, a Catholic priest at Letterfrack, wrote to the provisional government complaining that most of the people had no potatoes since Christmas, asking, quote, "What can your government do in helping to supply seed potatoes and oats?" Complete with his request for a local railway extension and support for the fishing industry, Godfrey's letter was at one with those that were received and addressed to Dublin Castle during 1898 and earlier food supply crises. Local government minister W.T. Cosgrave subsequently secured government approval for a £1,000 loan to relieve distress in Clifton, Oughterard and in Galway. However, Galway advised the Cabinet in early April that the loan was not required because the Irish White Cross had set aside £25,000 for the relief of distress in the west of Ireland. Nonetheless, the press had already by then characterised the distress in Connemara as famine, as this slide shows. Now, as earlier slides have shown, the food supply crisis was not actually limited to Connacht. Maud Gonne, veteran publicist of the 1898 food supply crisis in Ireland, France and America, travelled to Donegal with Charlotte Despard, where they found famine conditions prevailing in some districts. In letters to several newspapers, Gonne called on the provisional government to issue a loan of, quote, £200,000 for the purpose of saving the West from famine. She believed, optimistically, that, quote, Mr. De Valera and Commandant Rory O'Connor would be among the first subscribers. By May 1922, Kerry County Council heard of a death from starvation in Castle Gregory and starving people in the south of the county who had exhausted their credit with shopkeepers. Tellingly, the council appointed a deputation to wait on two sources of aid, the Irish White Cross and the government. Government assistance was afoot following Dáil approval of a £100,000 grant to relieve, in Cosgrave's words, economic distress of the most pronounced order, approaching famine in some areas. Dáil approval was not, however, without dissent. Cathal Brugha believed it to be a, quote, deliberate attempt to deplete the Dáil exchequer, while Sean T. O'Kelly, not unreasonably, argued that there was insufficient clarity as to how the grant would be spent. Nevertheless, the expenditure in 1922 was dwarfed when compared to the emergency relief measures that the government found it necessary to introduce in February 1925, when a more serious and internationally sensitive food supply crisis was underway. The emergency aspect of the government's 1925 measures had its origin in two cablegrams. On the 29th of January, the editor of the New York Evening World newspaper, it was owned by Joseph Pulitzer, whose journalism prize endures, pressed Cosgrave to address government reports of widespread famine in the west of Ireland, with many dying and freezing because of lack of fuel. A few days later, a second cablegram from John Devoy's Gaelic American newspaper asked Cosgrave to indicate what Irish America should do in response. James Douglas, of whom we heard earlier, of the treasurer of the White Cross, was not alone in believing that famine propaganda in America harmed the Irish Freed State and it needed to be countered. From his vantage point in Washington, Timothy Smithy, the crucially important and first Irish Free State diplomat, was even more concerned. He believed that the acceptance of American aid would discredit the Saorstát in the United States. Crucially, he recommended that if Cosgrave thought likewise, he should publish a statement that foreign aid was not necessary. Smithy's extraordinary preference to subordinate the needs of a hungry population to the reputation of the fledgling state did not convince Cosgrave. Smithy received two unambiguous instructions. First, he should not discourage help, but should discourage scare. And second, he should emphasize the relief works which the government had recently commenced. As alluded to earlier, propagandist newspaper photography was a potent political influence in the 1925 food supply crisis. Astonishingly, the ever-sympathetic Manchester Guardian published a photograph from the 1898 food supply crisis, which it represented as a contemporary record in 1925. In America, the Newspaper Enterprise Association published 2 articles and a series of photographs from Connemara under the emotive heading, Irish Famine Story at Hand. The articles were published throughout the United States and Canada. Meanwhile, Irish newspapers lavished widespread coverage of Cardinal Archbishop Patrick O'Donnell's cablegram of gratitude to Cardinal Hayes in New York. Hayes had offered $25,000, £5,000, to relieve distress in the west of Ireland. O'Donnell informed Hayes that there was no famine or significantly any need for a public appeal, and equally significantly that he would nonetheless accept the aid. It would, he said, be very useful. O'Donnell's famine denial was well publicised across the English-speaking world, and by mid-April it made its way to Russia. A prominent, well-informed front-page Pravda article, headlined "Famine in Ireland," denounced O'Donnell's stance. The article included a line drawing of an apparently well-fed O'Donnell depicted alongside an Irish peasant's cabin showing 3 hungry, dejected figures without food. The author accused the Irish Free State government of being in cahoots with the imperial government in London and admonished the English press, with the exception of the Manchester Guardian, for paying no attention to Irish hunger. He acknowledged the famine experience endured by Pravda readers during 1920-21 and appealed for their support. Finally, he hoped for the arrival of Dublin of, quote, a red ship under the red banner, which he believed would be of great support and political significance. The author was Jim Larkin. In conclusion, it was clear that despite the demise of the Unionist politics in the Irish Free State, the gravity of Ireland's last episodic food supply crisis remained politically divisive. Irish Labour cried famine and sought appeals of aid from overseas. In striking contrast, the Catholic hierarchy and nationalist government of the fledgling state denied famine, resisted appeals in the name of famine, but reluctantly accepted American aid. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noel. And I'll ask Michael now to step up to the podium. I did, speaking earlier to Noel, when he mentioned his find of that article in Pravda that red flags and went up immediately when he downloaded this Pravda article. But thank you so much. That was fantastic. So I'm going to hand over now to Michael, who's going to give us an idea of his own PhD research, which was partly enabled by the history bursary. So Michael is going to be looking at a particular family, the Ryan family, and the Civil War divisions in that particular family. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you. So good afternoon. So I'm currently doing my PhD on long-serving Minister James Ryan, and as I add, I'm very grateful for the help of Universities Ireland in completing this research. But today I am looking beyond just James Ryan and delving more into his wider family and their experience of the Civil War, as that you can see the family there. So as we know, the Irish Civil War was an intense and bitter conflict that fractured a nationalist movement that hitherto had been united in the pursuit of Irish independence. On one side of the divide were those who saw the 1921 treaty as a worthy compromise that offered substantial independence, if not quite the republic. On the other side were those who saw this lack of republic as nothing less than apostasy. It was a schism that was seen throughout the country, but it was also seen in microcosm within many individual families. Among the most significant was the Ryan family of Tumcool, County Wexford. So, as a family who embraced advanced nationalist ideas, the Ryans found themselves at the vanguard of the Republican movement. The youngest brother, James Ryan, or Jim, was medical officer in the GPO during Easter week and was subsequently elected a member of the First Dáil, while his sisters, namely Min, Agnes, Kit, Nell and Phyllis, were dedicated activists in Cumnaman. Furthermore, they married well within the confines of the revolutionary movement, and thus expanded their own revolutionary credentials. Jim Ryan married Maureen Cregan, a woman whose passion for Irish culture matched her zeal for the Republican cause. Agnes Ryan married former IRB president and prominent Belfast Republican Dennis McCullough. Min Ryan married Richard Mulcahy, of course, who was a 1916 rising hero and chief of staff of the IRA during the War of Independence. And Agnes Ryan married Sean T. O'Kelly, Sinn Féin's roving diplomat, and Sean T. in fact also went on to marry Phyllis Ryan much later after after Kit's untimely death. So they were a family that was very much at the heart of the struggle for independence, and they were firmly united in this pursuit. However, that dramatically changed with the signing of the treaty in December 1921. Jim, Phyllis, Kit, along with Sean T. and Maureen, opposed the treaty, while on the other side, Min and Agnes and their husbands, Mulcahy and McCullough, were in favour. So the precise reasons why some decided to support or oppose the treaty can be difficult to ascertain, and perhaps all we can say, as has been suggested, is that opinion over the treaty was to a great extent a matter of temperament. However, when members of the Ryan family considered this division later on, they were often disposed to blame the influence of others. In fact, Min Ryan would later recall that Jim and most of her sisters were initially in favour of the treaty, only to be turned by Sean T., Maureen or De Valera. Conversely, Jim recalled Min being firmly against the treaty at first, only to change her mind later, and he derided Mulcahy as a man who was simply blindly following Michael Collins. But looking beyond the actual accuracy of either Jim or Min's recollections, it is notable that both thought that deep down the other was on their side. Perhaps they thought it was just a matter of the other falling in with the wrong crowd. But whatever the reasons for members of the Ryan family choosing to support or oppose the treaty, this division was gradually enhanced as the various organisations within the national movement, such as the Dáil, Sinn Féin, the IRA and Cumnaman, took their positions on the treaty. The latter organisation, in which the Ryan sisters were so prominent, firmly voted against the treaty, resulting in Min and others forming an alternative pro-treaty organisation called Cumann Saoirse. But despite some last-ditch efforts at peace and unity, most notably expressed in the 1922 Collins-De Valera Pact election, where, for instance, the pro-treaty Agnes Ryan campaigned on behalf of her anti-treaty brother, there was little that could reconcile the intractable opposition of a significant proportion of the IRA to the treaty. Thus, a mixture of provocation, frustration and pressure resulted in a new national army shelling the anti-treaty garrison that was occupying the forecourts in June 1922. People on both sides now retreated into their respective camps. Jim immediately rallied to his beleaguered comrades in the forecourts, and Maureen Cregan carried dispatches for the anti-treaty forces across the city. Meanwhile, Mulcahy, now serving as Minister for Defence, urged his soldiers to put aside past friendships in suppressing the irregulars, or the madness from within, as he called them. He could not but have been conscious of his own family circumstances. But the disorganised anti-treaty forces were no match for Mulcahy's army. The National Army quickly asserted its military dominance, winning the battle in the capital and then moving to affirm its authority across the country. And within a few months, both Jim Ryan and Shanty O'Kelly would again find themselves imprisoned, where Jim eagerly joined with other prisoners in depicting Mulcahy as the supreme villain in this tragedy, labelling him as the one man to blame for all this. Meanwhile, as the anti-treaty IRA failed to hold territory by conventional means, they resorted to guerrilla tactics. This included targeting supporters of the new regime. Agnes Ryan's husband, Dennis McCullough, who was not in a position of authority himself, was among those targeted when his music shop was bombed by the end of 1922, an action that only hardened divisions within the family. But as the anti-treaty forces adopted more unconventional means, the Free State government responded in kind, which infamously included the policy of executions, with Erskine Childers, of course, being among the earliest victims. This particularly shocked many, and several of the Ryan sisters made a desperate attempt to prevent Childers' execution by urging Min to use her influence to save his life. The sisters beseeched Min Ryan to think of 1916, and Kit Ryan even went as far as to suggest that Min Ryan should leave her husband behind. There was clearly a belief among the Ryan sisters that Min's heart was not in the cause, but this is unlikely, as she was not a passive actor in the Civil War. As, for instance, she had no hesitation in writing a long letter in defence of the treaty to the mother of a family friend who was executed by the Free State in March 1923. But although she was firm in her position, the intense pressure of the Civil War could not but have impacted Min, especially when it looked like one of her sisters would fall victim to the conflict. Nell Ryan was arrested in February 1923 for her continued rebellious activities with Cumann na mBan, and soon after she joined other women in embarking on a hunger strike. Nell was resolute and would not contemplate surrender. Min was again under pressure from her family members to influence Mulcahy to secure Nell's release. Placed in such an impossible situation, Min was reportedly under severe stress that she became ill and was confined to her bed. Although, when Nell was informed of this, she dismissed the very notion that her sister's distress resulted from any concern for her. But ultimately, Nell did not die, as after 34 days without food, the government released her in late April. Her cause was no doubt helped by the fact that the Civil War was entering its very final stages. And the Free State's ultimate victory in May still left them with thousands of Republican prisoners, which included Jim Ryan and Shanty O'Kelly. But frustration with their continued imprisonment led the prisoners to launch a mass hunger strike towards the end of 1923. While most prisoners abandoned the strike relatively quickly, the most intractable, including Jim Ryan, remained ready to make a last desperate stand. For Jim, surrendering to Mulcahy, the murderer-in-chief as he called him, was utterly intolerable. He repeatedly made it clear to his family that no one was to appeal to his powerful relations under any circumstances. Death was preferable to any engagement with his erstwhile comrade and brother-in-law. But ultimately, after Jim's 36th day on hunger strike, the haphazard organisation of the strike led to its ultimate breakdown, and he was fortunately released soon after. So, fortunately, the fact that neither he nor any of his family died as a result of the Civil War left the door open for reconciliation, which would be achieved in part by the strong familial bonds that continue to exist and were nurtured by other more neutral-minded members of the family. And this reconciliation can obviously be seen in this photo much later. But it's also worth noting that some of the first tentative steps towards engagement across the divide were made by Min Ryan as early as June 1923, after the conflict had just ended, when she wrote to Maureen Cregan requesting the return of an Irish dictionary that she had borrowed from her in friendlier times. With her husband still imprisoned, it was unsurprising that Maureen was not impressed by the letter. Nonetheless, Min's letter, where she noted that her determination to study Irish was because, as she said, more of us now feel we can go on more or less unimpeded in our struggle for this country's freedom, serves as a reminder that she, Min Ryan, like her anti-treaty siblings, had the same passion for the Irish language and Irish independence. And this is perhaps central in understanding how reconciliation could be achieved. For in an absolute sense, there was more that united them than divided them. The Irish Civil War was not a grand battle that pitted diametrically opposed ideologies against one another. Rather, it was more like a fight between two branches of the same tree, perhaps something akin to a family row, which in the case of the Ryan family, it very literally was. Thank you.
There you go. Yep. Maybe we just have time for, it's a history blitz, so we're going to blitz some questions. And I can already see here, if you just hang on 1 minute, the mic is coming towards you. Michael, would you put that mic on? Yeah, brilliant. Yes, please.
Hello there. I was fascinated by the Noel's piece there on the forgotten famine of 1925, because I have come across an application that was made to Fermanagh County Council in 1925 for relief work for the Eshnadara area, mountainous district in East Fermanagh. Given the figures that you put up there, of relief works in southern border counties as they were becoming, or whatever, it was interesting that the application from Eshnadara to Fermanagh County Council, which at the time had been prorogued and then reconstituted with a unionist majority, was turned down on the basis that Eshnadara was in the Rosslea district, which under the report of the Boundary Commission was likely to be transferred to the Free State. And I'm just wondering, had other areas, like I'm thinking in particular, like South Armagh or the Ahiarn district in West Tyrone, which would be fairly impoverished at the time, did you come across any instances of famine in those areas, and were there relief works for them?
Thank you.
No, not particularly. There's not a very good deal of information on how that money was dispersed and how it was particularly used. In fact, those figures come from what was not referred to at the time, but was effectively a press briefing. It was an Irish Times report in which press reporters had been invited in by the government to emphasise the extent to which these works were underway. Because more than anything, the government was hugely sensitive to the potential damage that was undoubtedly being done in America, where invariably a food supply problem in some of the country, most certainly the western part of the country, was being represented as famine. And famine is something, a word that effectively the government, when it was operating from Dublin Castle, could not tolerate, and the fledgling state new government couldn't tolerate it either. So I don't have any detail as to whether or not across border locations fared differently because of any other circumstances.
Thanks to both speakers, very interesting papers, but I have a couple of quick questions for Noel, if I may. First one is, what was causing these food shortages in the west of Ireland? Secondly, do we have any figures on excess mortality? How many people might have died as a result? And thirdly, why was this the last one in 1925? Thank you.
Sorry, the last part was why?
Why was this the last food crisis in 1925? What changed afterwards?
Oh, yes. Okay, well, there's lots of several issues in this. First of all, excess mortality, there wasn't any. Several claims then, and indeed through all of the crises food-wise that there had been in the western part of Ireland in 1922, in 1907, 1898, 1895, 1891, all had significant claims on nationalist sides that there was starvation to death and excess deaths, but it was never really any recorded as such. No death certificates were issued with this, and when the local government board had seizure before the Irish Free State, they investigated these things sufficiently to the point where you could determine that the death wasn't by starvation. What caused it essentially is that, surprisingly, after the famine and the major rearrangement of land and tenure and size of land you have on the extreme western seaboard in Donegal, Galway, Mayo, Clare, Kerry and Cork. Communities that are still potato-centric, that are heavily dependent on summer migration. The problem in 1925 is serious unemployment in the territories to which the migration would normally take place. So there's huge economic pressure, even in 1922, for migration that cannot effectively take place to relieve the pressure in the western seaboards, and is even more serious in 1925. So it's the extent to which there are these isolated communities, extraordinarily high levels of really small land tenure, land that's absolutely beyond being commercially viable. What actually makes it the last one in 1995? The beginnings of the structural changes. Now, the Land Acts in 1923 was being promised as the great panacea, but Land Acts by themselves hadn't finished this. Ironically, the language, the whole area around the Gaeltacht movement, and the movement of people to the relocation of people to holdings in westwards, if you like, did change it. But certainly 25 was the last of what was a very clear, discernible pattern of these supply crises happening after the famine.
Perhaps one final question, are we blitzed? Well, if there are no other questions, could we just thank our two speakers and our two Universities Ireland History Bursary recipients for sharing with us their research and their PhD research. So thank you very much to Noel and Michael. Thank you. Unplug yourself.
Okay, so if our panelists want to join us, we'll all take our seats here, as I'm just conscious of the time and people who may have to get trains. We're still waiting on one. So you're first, Gemma, so you can sit there, yeah. And then we go Linda and then we go Andy. Great.
Power, I just plugged it in because I was slowly.
What power flex does it take? Is it USB-C? I have a charger in my bag.
Oh, so no, it's gone up a bit now. It's okay. It's
Oh, okay. Yeah, you'll get through that.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, if you have any issues, just.
No, it's just more that there's not many plugs around.
I know.
Because it's such an old room.
I think there is one under the lectern if you did need it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So just if you want, we have a minute now. Sure, go. I think yeah, just in case, just. So, yeah, I'll give you it. So, thank you everyone, and You're all very welcome for the fifth and final session of today's conference. We have moved from crisis to division to violence, which I think is an appropriate theming of the three panels because it does bring us through the trajectory of 1922 from crisis into division and finally into violence in this staging of a Cold War that becomes a hot war, as we've heard earlier today. So I want to introduce our three speakers in order. I'll introduce them as they get set up on the podium. And our first speaker of today is Dr. Gemma Clark of the University of Exeter. Her books include Everyday Violence in the Irish Civil War, and she's currently working on sectarianism, gender-based violence and arson in outlets including the Irish Times, Irish Historical Studies and the Atlas, the Irish Revolution and Ireland 1922 previously. But she's currently working on a global history of arson and received British Academy funding in relation to this project for exporting arson, incendiarism as protest in the global Irish diaspora. So Gemma's talk today is Everyday Violence, Harming People and Property in the Irish Civil War. Gemma, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Conor. Is that mic okay? Because I moved things around to try and plug myself in. Fantastic. And thanks to Universities Ireland for the invitation and for supporting this event, and especially thank you to Tricia Kelly for all the logistics and getting me over here from England, so that's great. Okay, so I thought I'd start with a kind of brief recap of my first book, Everyday Violence in the Irish Civil War, which was published with Cambridge in 2014, scarily, long time ago now. But then I don't want to dwell too long on that because I want to explain how my research has evolved since then, but also how the field of Civil War studies has expanded during this decade of centenaries and the concurrent or perhaps consequent opening of archives, funding for research on and heightened public interest in the revolution, in Ireland's governance and society over these years, but of course focusing particularly on this kind of this end stage, if you like, that we're now into. So this book, Everyday Violence, added to military histories of the conflict over the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Michael Hopkinson being the classic study, Green Against Green, and Eunan spoke about some other of the military aspects of the conflict. It did this by analysing the function of violence at a micro level. So I brought to light interpersonal violence and property damage, including arson, threats, boycotts, attacks on animals, and so on, which I interpreted using not only Irish historiography and earlier histories of violence, but also wider theories, notably Stathis Kalivas' logic of violence as control of people and territory, and this is intrinsic to civil war by definition as armed combat within the boundaries of a sovereign entity between two or more parties subject to a common authority at the outset of hostilities. Now, there are various kind of issues with that basic definition, and we'll probably touch upon some of those and reflect, how kind of, as part of this talk and this kind of panel, reflecting on the value of some of these labels and how we endeavour to categorise and what often seems difficult to rationalise. Now, Andy's going to speak more about the history of Munster, but I also focused on some of this province and specifically the counties of Tipperary, Limerick and Waterford within my first book, and I argued that violence served two key functions. First of all, community regulation, by which I mean the punishment and, in some cases, expulsion of religious and political minorities to rout the independent state of British influence, kind of decolonisation. And secondly, a motive for land redistribution, or at least an expression of land hunger. So I'm going to explain these two, which also helps, points 1 and 2, which also helps me, incorporates and leads to a discussion of new approaches and areas for investigation around the mapping, periodising and categorising of violence. So, issue 1, community regulation. I didn't set out to write a history of religious minorities or political minorities at all. What I was doing was cataloguing thousands of aggressive and intimidating acts as recorded in compensation claims submitted to British and Free State government schemes, and from that observed patterns, one of which really stood out was this disproportionate impact of various forms of Civil War violence on Protestants and Loyalists, broadly speaking. So focusing on arson for one example, which is notable for because it's very destructive and can be highly targeted. 19% of arson attacks in Munster, in the places I studied, were attributable to the claimant's, quote, allegiance to the UK. Now, of course, loyalty isn't always synonymous with Protestantism, but if we look just at religion, which can be checked, it's significant that 19% of arson attacks were targeted at a group that made up a much smaller and shrinking percentage of the overall population. So only around 2 to 5% in the 3 counties that I looked at. So that book then kind of adds qualitatively to the phenomenon recorded in the censuses between 1911 and 1926, which we can see on the slide. So that's, in other words, that much faster decline of the non-Catholic, largely Protestant population compared to the majority Catholic population. Now, even considering some of the pitfalls, which are probably quite obvious already, of the source material, looking at records of violence that were created for the purpose of financial remuneration, the personal testimonies I assembled nonetheless speak very powerfully to the role played by violence and intimidation in the departure from the Free State, or what became the Free State, of what different historians have kind of quantified in different ways, but Andy looked at a kind of a range of somewhere between 2,000 and 16,000 Protestants whose leaving can't be attributed to normal patterns, so British demobilisation or ordinary economic voluntary migration. Now, this isn't as controversial as a claim to make as it used to be, looking at these issues. I'm sure we're all familiar with Peter Hart's infamous work, Taking It Out on the Protestants, to quote the title of his chapter, in Revolutionary Cork, and that's been nuanced further by people, many of whom we are here or are known to us, the late David Fitzpatrick, Andy, of course, Mary Coleman, Brian Hughes, Ian Dalton, and others who explore themes of loyalty and depopulation, and the notion of minority experience more broadly, which I think is a really interesting emerging theme. It was the subject of the Irish Historians in Britain conference this year, looking at all types of social, political, ethnic minorities. But this sectarian or not, a character of the independence struggle is understandably still a matter that interests Irish and British publics, especially when more problematic anniversaries come around, and we've talked about a few of them today, but the centenary of the Dunmanway massacre, so-called, for example, the killing of 13 Protestant civilians in the Bandon Valley of West Cork in April 1922, which was the subject of this year's West Cork History Festival. Now, this was, a really awful but rare atrocity, and violent spectacles such as these understandably capture more attention, particularly when we're in a period of reflection such as we are, than the thousands of small acts of intimidation and harm that I studied in my first book. And they become a convenient canvas on which wider agendas and ideologies play out. But that's not to say we shouldn't remember them. And in fact, returning recently to this controversial question of sectarianism in the context of the centenary, being asked to comment on these kind of issues and anniversaries, has been really useful for me in my ongoing interest in civil war. And that's why I started with that very kind of conventional theoretical definition from Calivas, because it's understanding the violence that takes place within this framework that can help us make sense of things that seem so often so abhorrent. And at Exeter, I teach a module that looks at this form of warfare as I defined it, which is increasingly common in the modern era, also particularly destructive, seen across the globe. And returning then to these issues of sectarianism within this Civil War framework reminds me not only of the power of revenge and retaliation as a motive for Civil War violence, but also perhaps the importance of not getting too caught up, even though that's what I've just been doing, in this theorizing and ascribing motivation, calling something sectarian, calling it ethnic, calling it labour violence, at the expense of listening to the voices of those who experienced violence at the time. That's really important. And so, therefore, ethnic cleansing, as a term, would not describe accurately the mistreatment of minorities in Ireland, at least certainly not in the communities that I looked at. Nonetheless, terms such as massacre, extermination, crusade, and pogrom, as John Dorney mentioned earlier, recur in the sources as descriptions of these events and these violent encounters. And these resonate strongly with people at the time, this terminology, people who saw violence against them as part of a wider persecution on the grounds of religion or on the grounds of other forms of loyalty. And of course, I don't need to explain the importance in this arena of thinking about this in an all-island perspective as well. Violence against, if we're looking at minorities, or newly created minorities, we have to think about violence against Catholics in the newly partitioned Northern Ireland, which included the burning of whole Catholic streets. So you could argue that then comes closer to this label, comes closer to systematic removal of an outgroup than the targeting of Southern Protestants did. I'm sure, again, you all listened to this. It was on throughout the last year, but the BBC Northern Irelands podcast, Year 21. I talk about these themes a little bit more in the episode I did on the Belfast pogrom, or the Belfast pogrom, if we're going to use the speech marks from the time. How, if you look at the tactics used, especially arson, this points to religiously motivated violence on the part of both civilians and security forces. So violence can be said to be religiously driven when religious words, symbols, objects are used, such as fire being a classic cleansing tool. And so these cultural history readings are helpful in seeing meaning, especially in acts that are difficult to analyse because they're criminal, they're taboo, they're difficult to talk about. And that's why it's great to see in the last few years, since I sort of started writing on this period and this conflict, scholars using linguistic and literary analysis, emotions history, to engage with the impact of violence. And obviously, Shifa Aiken's work is an excellent example of that. We could also look at Anne Dolan, Cuivan Nick Ovaid. So since I wrote about everyday violence, there's been so much good work to understand how various motivations, identities, and agendas all intersect in the Civil War. Which brings me to the second key contribution of the book, which was an exploration of land issues underpinning much of the sort of local conflict in Ireland. So that's issue 2. So the disproportionate of targeting of big houses, so the Anglo-Irish mansions, accounting for 25% of buildings burned in the areas I looked at, evidences on the one hand a physical and symbolic routing of landlordism, a performative decolonisation, if you like, necessary for the anti-treaty IRA at least because of the inadequate terms of a treaty that maintained the link with Britain through the oath of allegiance to the Crown. But the most common category of arson actually was the burning of crops, outhouses, we can see from the stats. And this has forced the middle-class Catholic farmers out of their homes, off their holdings. And this has been built on again in the last few years. So Gavin Foster, Pat McCarthy, Tony Varley, others, that adding to these themes of social class, labour, land rights, all these themes that ran through my book as a sort of undercurrent, if you like, but they've really been foregrounded in the last few years, which is great. And credit's also due to Terry Dooley there, and all his work on opening records and perspectives. So hopefully, in the coming years, with greater access to Land Commission records, we'll find out even more about post-independence transfers and how lasting the seizure of farms and intimidation of graziers via burning, via cattle driving really was. What was the lasting impact of some of the violence that I I studied that resulted in people leaving their homes for weeks, months and years, some of whom were able to come back and others had to begin a completely new life. So finding out, in other words, what's going on alongside conventional militarism is something that's really interested me and evidently interesting others. So I want to expand a little more now on three of these key kind of approaches and themes that have emerged from those conclusions over the last sort of 8 to 10 years in looking at the study of the Civil War. Now, of course, we've always understood the value of geographical analysis and historical research and appreciate the role of the physical and built environment in sustaining conflict. Justin Dolan-Stover argues that the Irish landscape served as a fifth column for the IRA throughout the Revolution, Republicans using their surroundings and their knowledge of like the mountainous districts in, say, North Tipperary to outpace their opponents. But then there's also much more we can read into the purpose and symbolism of destruction, which is explored again by Terry Dooley and his Burning of the Big House, which came out this year. Stover has got a new book called Enduring Ruin with UCD Press, so again, just coming out very soon. And I really like John's point earlier, similarly to this, about almost the symbolism of using Unionist buildings in Dublin to house northern refugees. Not only can we look at sort of how the environment was targeted qualitatively, we can also map literally episodes of violence, help spot patterns, as the team behind the UCC and Cork University Press Atlas did so successfully in 2017. And the image on the left is a visualisation of the evidence I collected for my book from the British government's compensation body, the Irish Grants Committee on Everyday Violence in Limerick, Tipperary and Waterford. And again, as I'm sure you know, that project's expanded over the last year or so to bring that research to people in a more accessible manner. So, short videos, online articles. There's also, on this theme of mapping, geography, been some great initiatives, city and county council funded initiatives to understand further the geographical variation in the intensity of Civil War violence. So writing for Sean Gannon's collection called The Inevitable Conflict, which focused on County Limerick, really encouraged me to look again at some of my case studies from that county, reflect further on how the environment, how the economy shaped violence against infrastructure, so railways in that case, and commerce, the dairy industry, which was a really important part of County Limerick's economy. And also, as a full 100 years have passed since the official outbreak of the Civil War, if we pin that down to June 1922, although, as Eunan put it earlier, I thought it was, it's not this case that we suddenly have the referee blows the whistle and the new phase of the war starts. We have to think about how combatants at the time saw what the conflict was around them. We're also inclined to take stock of the event, not just in terms of events, just in terms of geography, but also chronology, thinking about different periodizations. Now, this might sound like obvious, but it's in these kind of important centenary publications we had, like Ireland 1922, they're valuable in looking at the whole year as a calendar year, rather than imposing kind of military or literary markers. So we look at Civil War case studies. I wrote about the burning of Tullamarine Castle in their national and global context. We see what happened across a whole 12 months, perhaps more akin to how it was experienced at the time, within its without sort of privileging things that occurred in certain stages, the military phase or the guerrilla phase and so on. And so writing this chapter sort of encouraged me to also to look at earlier displays of British loyalism and land issues that, in addition to and intersecting with the war over the treaty, might explain the burning of this particular hunting lodge in October 1922. So the final kind of approach I wanted to mention was in terms of, I like how it's changed the light, it's really gone quite orange, is categorizing violence. So mapping it, periodizing it in different ways, isolating a single act for analysis. And the case study I chose to focus on in the volume of 1922 reflects this growing interest that also Conor mentioned in my introduction in this longer history of fire as protest. And this project I'm doing kind of challenges the idea of fire as a weapon of the weak and argues that the efficacy of fire setting as both insurgency and counterinsurgency lies not only in its physical capacity to destroy infrastructure and resources that the enemy might use, but also burning or threatening to burn works well as intimidation to control behaviour and territory, which is intrinsic to civil war as a conflict type, as well as kind of communicate hostility in a more abstract, symbolic sense. And I've written about this for a forthcoming Oxford handbook on insurgency and counterinsurgency, where I look not only at Republicans' use of fire, but also British forces, the burning of Cork as an act of colonial state violence. And these interconnected practical, psychological, political functions of incendiarism are key findings not only in civil war studies, during internal conflict, when you face the prospect of living side by side afterwards, and perhaps nation building, as in the case of Ireland, violence is being used more to change minds rather than destroy lives completely. So it contributes to understanding of civil war, but also, hopefully, adds to this growing interest in how criminal acts develop into really effective forms of collective violence and modern conflict. And I wrote a blog post about this called Forged by Fire, if you're interested, where I kind of wrote set out a bit of a history of arson within Ireland and Britain. So what I'm doing with this new research then is delving further into function and symbolism. So why burn? It's not that obvious. Why would you burn things rather than enact violence in other ways? It might seem like an easy way of easy, accessible, performative violence, but actually, when you look at accounts of house burnings from Bureau of Military Witness statements, pension files, you see that actually it was perhaps more dangerous and difficult than we might expect. What can we kind of find out from these records about how it felt, the experience, the emotions of these acts? In Dan Breen's account of the burning of Marlfield in County Tipperary, we see perhaps some regret, potentially at the use of this target. I mean, it seems like quite a straightforward statement of military logic: reprisal, counter-reprisal. We burned houses because they executed us, and Bagwell was an obvious target because he was membership of the Seanad. But we also see something a little bit more complex here, this kind of idiosyncratic phrasing: houses were given to the flames rather than actively burned, could maybe suggest a shirking of responsibility. We see something similar if we look at William Gallois' research on the use of smoking out of resistance groups in French Algeria. He similarly sees this resort to the passive voice as a means of kind of imputing responsibility for the deaths of Algerians to inanimate forms such as smoke, flames, or the environment. And, he's almost like lamenting this tactic. He, to a degree, feels sorry for the Bagwells. Perhaps, arson is dirty compared to the more glamorous, manly forms of violence that we see that were so favoured and have been explored by, someone like Anne Dolan, who's written about masculinity and gun culture at this time. This isn't about sectarian cleansing, in other words. This is about an attack on what Bagwell represents, the sort of seamless transition between the British and the Free State regimes, and, or crucially, what he owns, because property, not people, really bears the brunt of civil war violence. And on this theme, I'm going to finish soon because I realise I've gone a little bit over, but on this theme of the relative scarcity of lethal, serious interpersonal violence, I'm pointing that out, but I don't mean to minimise the devastating impact of non-lethal violence on thousands of civilians, and especially of gender-based violence, which I imagine Linda will allude to. But I did nonetheless find, when I researched this and looked at kind of a quantitative study, and again, no method is perfect in understanding these very horrific and traumatizing forms of violence, that it didn't serve the strategy or ideology of either side to denigrate women en masse. So, women were treated relatively humanely because the genocidal aims underlying warfare in Ireland were underlying warfare in other civil wars were absent in Ireland, and again, that's why it's helpful to put Ireland in this bigger international picture. Nonetheless, I find that the kind of taking the gender approach, a gender lens, even if you're not looking at gender acts per se, can really be helpful, and there's various books that have inspired me in that way, and I'll show a couple on the slide there, but it kind of made me come back to looking at some of the accounts that I'd looked at for the first book and thought about the fact that, you know, I looked at this testimony from Louisa Bagwell, who was in Marlfield, the big house that was burned, as a sort of evidence of, you know, no personal harm, but actually it's really kind of suggestive, I think, of more intimate forms of violence and the particular vulnerability of women to arson and to civil war violence in general, when violence enters the domestic sphere. So the purpose of my first book was to write the first non-military history of the Irish Civil War, understand the relationship between the micro and the macro, and it's so encouraging that since then there's been so much more work to recover perspectives of ordinary people, and especially those who were marginalised in traditional histories, which includes women, of course, but also religious, political minorities. And I hope, even though I've flown through it a little bit, I hope I've also shown some of the benefit of new approaches in the mapping, periodisation and categorisation of civil war violence. I liked what Shifa said before about overemphasis on silence, kind of occluding literary and other urges to tell what happened. Maybe the overemphasis on politics in the memory of the Civil War, you know, which is understandable given the treaty divisions were kind of encoded in the party system until very recently. Maybe that's discouraged kind of close focus on the act of violence itself, but via analysis of patterns and stats, cultural history readings of meaning and symbolism, we can come much closer to an understanding of why people fight, of the logic of what often seems awful and illogical. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gemma. Our next speaker is Professor Linda Connolly. Linda is Professor of Sociology at Maynooth University, where she's also Director of the Social Sciences Institute. Earlier this year, she was also visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge's Centre for Gender Studies. Her recent publications include Irish Women's Movement from Revolution to Devolution, documenting Irish feminisms, the second wave with Tina O'Toole, and with Niamh Horrigan, social movements in Ireland. Pertinent particularly to the research today is both her work on the Irish family and then women in the Irish Revolution, which you just saw on the last slide, which is feminism, activism and violence, and that was published by Irish Academic Press in 2020. Linda's paper today is The Conduct of the Free State and Republican Forces in the Irish Civil War, How War is Highly Gendered. So, you're on time, Linda. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I think I've slightly moved away from my title, but it will become apparent as we go along. Such things happen. So first of all, thank you so much for the invite to speak today. Thank you, Tricia, for all your assistance and patience with unanswered emails on my part due to a busy few weeks. I'm also really pleased to be speaking with Gemma and Andy. The last time both of you spoke, I was actually listening in the audience at West Cork, which was one of our first outings after the pandemic. So I've really enjoyed, the way that our work, the three of us, really enriches and questions each other in a very collegial and healthy way. So I'm delighted to be on this panel. I'm going to start. I thought what I would do, given that it's the end of the day and I can see everyone's a bit tired, and I'm a bit tired myself, being honest, but I thought I would start and I will talk about a substantive case that I've been looking at in the Civil War, and I've written quite a bit on this topic in recent years, so I don't want to sort of necessarily repeat a lot of things I've written, but I do want to start with some reflections on the process of commemoration of the Civil War, because I think that's very important to, in a sense, pause for thought. We're in the middle of it, and so I'm going to try and relate that to some strands of my work. So the state-sponsored Decade of Centenaries programme in Ireland has reached its final stage. Some might say, thank God. Others will probably be lamenting its passing. And marking the centenary of a divisive and bitter internal civil war that occurred a century ago obviously presents many unavoidable challenges despite the language of reconciliation being stressed and promoted by the state, including most recently by the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach in national concert hall speeches. But in my experience, suppressed hurt has bubbled, privately and publicly, especially in relation to national army, or what you might call state violence. So I'm not going to talk so much today about the anti-treaty violence and Eunan picked up on some points around my work, which was very helpful, thank you. But I am going to talk a little bit about state violence and how, when the state is leading the commemoration, is also, in a way, we need to question how that state might be implicated in some of the violence that occurred. That's quite a big claim, but it'll become apparent as I go along. And so as I said earlier, where there is a remembering, there will also be forgetting, and that comes from Paul Ricoeur and also the work of Guy Biner and others. So state violence and killing is particularly controversial and sensitive, I would suggest, at the current conjuncture. However, this paper assesses how women's experience of the Irish Civil War has been situated in the commemoration process underway. We know, of course, traditionally that women's experience of war was hidden from history, relegated more to the realm of forgetting than the remembering that I was talking about. The case study of Margaret Doherty in Foxford, County Mayo, who was attacked by 3 Free State Army officers in 1923, May 27, 1923, is examined today in terms of how historical evidence can now prove sexual violence was a real feature of the Irish Civil War, despite strong denial to the contrary in academia and indeed in public discourse. But moreover, the ethics and the challenge of conducting such research in the present, 100 years after, are also considered. Traumatic memory, it is argued, is manifest and exists parallel to what we might call official commemoration efforts. It exists within families, amongst neighbours in communities, and, in terms of my interests, within individuals, intergenerationally. So living memory of trauma in women's lives in particular, which is my interest, cannot be neatly erased, othered, or forgotten. Now, the momentum that the state's programme of commemoration has gathered has prompted scholars who were previously uninvolved in the field to become fast producers of Irish revolutionary studies, and this is to be encouraged. But I think, listening to Gemma, was a pioneer of the Civil War, studying the Civil War when it wasn't so popular, perhaps, as it is this year. But it's also the commemoration process has also caused established scholars of the Irish Revolution and of revolutions more broadly understood in Irish studies to pause for thought and to re-evaluate, including in relation to our ongoing obligations and responsibilities to what we might call dark parts of Ireland's emotional and psychological history. In particular, scholarly efforts to document or sanitise more difficult issues to do with Civil War violence during the decade can be critically considered by interdisciplinary scholars at the current conjuncture, and I think the timing is very important in that sense. So, of course, we know that all transgressive violence, which is the topic of our panel, runs a risk of being voyeuristic, of being used to sensationalise, or just being simplistically described. And I think we need to watch that with the pension files and all the other sources, because they're so accessible, there's a tendency to just describe them. So I'm quite interested in questions around power and how power is reproduced through the kinds of narratives that are in the news sources. Gender-based violence is particularly difficult to question or investigate at any point in time due to an inbuilt denial that this could have even occurred to any great extent when compared to violence caused by firing military weapons, for example, which Eunan was talking about earlier. Also, how we approach these questions is very important. A tendency to just focus on how such crimes, and remember, we are talking about crimes, gender-based violence, sexual violence, which I also talk about, are crimes, and how these fit into mainstream mainstream modern Irish history writing on violence and the revolution can be the focus. So how these topics fit into those frameworks, rather than engaging more meaningfully with different scholarly expertise and evidence in the field of conflict-related social violence, sexual violence, which is specific to small or guerrilla wars. So it's important, I think, to look at other kinds of literatures and sources to understand this. So as I've demonstrated in publications in 2019 and 2020, postulating that Ireland's revolution might be considered a low-rape war is not the same as suggesting it was a no-rape war. And that comes back to questions of scale and also the kind of conflict that the Irish Civil War was, and indeed the War of Independence. These are small-scale conflicts when you compare them, to the much larger wars that occurred in other parts of Europe, both at that time, but also in later decades. So, nonetheless, this is not a question that can be ignored, and serious methodological and ethical questions therefore arise alongside a reluctance to categorically acknowledge that survivors of sexual violence and assault have not been fully recognised as casualties of war in Irish historical studies. So I want to challenge that. Damage to property, for instance, which Gemma is looking at and which is critically important, is easier to document in some ways because it's easier to report. So sexual violence, in contrast, is covert and not really quantifiable, as Joanna Burke has argued in her very large text on the history of rape and sexual assault. Also, the way in which these violences are recorded is framed by the assumptions around gender, the body, and sexuality. Military perpetrators of such crimes, for instance, typically enjoy impunity in trials and only appear as innocents in archives many decades later. So what I'm interested in is that women's personal testimonies of such violence are likewise, by definition, bound to be rare for those reasons. But they do exist. And it's those kind of micro examples, I think, which are very important in acknowledging these more hidden and more difficult aspects of transgressive violence in the Civil War. So a few more remarks about the context. I suppose the fact that the Irish state has not to date officially acknowledged gender-based and sexual violence as an aspect of the Irish Revolution sits very uncomfortably, in my view, alongside contemporary political statements about eradicating this huge social problem in contemporary Irish society and in recent global conflicts. So in other words, if the question isn't being properly acknowledged in the past, how can it be actually politically addressed in the present? But methodologically, challenges also arise. The newly available documentary sources, many of which are referred to today, pensions, compensation claims, witness statements, these often vividly describe how people in Ireland experienced civil war. So earlier in my career, I was more focused on what women were doing. What were they doing to challenge society? What were they doing in social movements and political movements? But this phase of my work is really more interested in experience. What happened to women in this period and in other periods? So I suppose that the experience which is captured in these new sources, however, can be used, I think, in a derivative way to sort of pepper confident master narratives of the period, and often the seriousness and destruction of crimes against the person, as opposed to crimes against property, etc., can get lost in translation. So such evidence, I argue, can or should also be interconnected with a deeper historical understanding and privileging of personhood, with the agency, voice, and first hand of revolutionaries or civilians prioritised. So much of my, I suppose, research and writing from an early period beyond the revolution in relation to other topics has focused on gender-based violence in the public and private spheres. Women's articulation of their lived experience is methodologically prioritised ethically and theoretically. However, and it's a different kind of silence, I think, to what's been discussed here, in terms of crimes against the person, silence, secrecy, trauma, and stigma typically follows sexual violence in particular. So what I want to argue, I suppose, is that research methods that fully includes first-person experience and testimonies can serve to destigmatize, rather than stigmatize or even re-stigmatize survivors of transgressive violence and their families who still hold to this day an intergenerational memory of what happened to their female relatives 100 years ago. And we know this in researching all historical abuse, that the danger of re-traumatizing, of re-stigmatizing, it needs to be, I suppose, dealt with very carefully. And we were talking about the documentary earlier. That also applies to intergenerational questions that might be in the past. Okay. So I'm just going to move forward a bit because I'm spending a bit more time than I thought in the first part. So I just want to say then, I suppose I was going to just say very briefly about women have always been obviously actors, central actors in Irish revolutionary social and political movements, and this wasn't a new finding of the decade of centenaries. So particularly in the 1980s, Margaret Ward, who was here earlier, and others expertly articulated how women were critical activists as Republicans and nationalists, including in the period what we now refer to as the Irish Revolution. And just as a remark in terms of, because I am talking about a Republican woman in a moment, but just, I think for several decades, and I'm doing this long enough to remember this, the study of Republican women was impacted by the nationalist and revisionist controversy that dominated the interdisciplinary arena of Irish studies for such a long time. So there was this kind of, that was one aspect, but the other was a tendency to treat Irish women's history and experience as marginal, or something over there that was separate from the real canonical debate at the time. So more recently, I think the study of Republican women in particular, through these new sources, has become more mainstreamed, in a sense, in the centre ground of the field. And any unease, I suppose, or stigma of studying this seems to have been replaced by a range of new documentaries and books and sources and all the rest. Okay, so women in a way were the eyes, the ears, and the linchpins of the revolution, carefully navigating information, strategic movement, and the harbouring and protecting of men. And in a way, the war would not have been possible, the Civil War, without the involvement and input of women. The newly released sources like the military services pensions, which are in effect I suppose, applications for some kind of compensation, have enabled scholars to draw on the early foundational work on women's activism in the revolution, and also to add additional evidence and analysis. Women's experience of participating specifically in the Irish Civil War as combatants, it relates to what you're saying, Gemma, was clearly shaped by the nature of warfare and reprisal in different locales and counties, as well as by the attitudes of men to women in different brigades around the country. So there's a lot of diversity there you can look at. It might not have been the same. I'm also in that collection on Limerick. What was happening in Limerick was quite different to what was happening in Mayo, which is more what I'm focusing on here. So in particular, more detailed micro-studies of transgressive National Army conduct is now possible, linking individual accounts with geography and structural violence. In relation to County Mayo, for instance, the Military Services Pension online collection contains 256 applications by women who were from or spent time in County Mayo. And in a way, that's a sort of a PhD waiting to be done by somebody. That's quite a large amount of data in a specific context. And all of these, I haven't read all 256, but I've read quite a few of them, all of them attest to the dangerous work conducted, but also the risk of violence. And in a way, again, it's that focus on what women and men do in conflict, but also the experience or what is felt, and the felt risk and fear is something I think which also deserves attention. So again, there's lots of them. Women like Greta Mullins, Kate Noon, and others applied for pensions and documented their work in great detail. Many, of course, were denied a pension, despite very strong references from their male and female comrades and political representatives. So the post-revolutionary period, as we know, was a cold place in numerous respects for women who had sacrificed their health and wealth and placed themselves in grave danger. Women were not considered or subsequently commemorated as war heroes, as Eunan was talking about earlier, or as sheroes is a term that I've heard more recently. So they were not commemorated in this way as elemental to the revolutionary struggle. And in other respects, in fact, were constructed as irrational, misguided fanatics, haplessly controlled by men, or just quite simply deranged. So just to move on to the final part. So many women were, of course, also clearly traumatized by the violence of both the War of Independence and the Civil War, and experienced subsequent mental health issues, physical health issues, and economic hardship that can now be better quantified, studied further, and scrutinized from an interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and theoretical perspective. The patriarchal nature of the new state arguably compounded some of these problems further. However, new accessible written sources, such as pension or compensation files, are now being read in different ways by scholars, writers, and indeed the public. In fact, as we were arguing in UCC, Shiva, in the summer, a trauma turn is perhaps arguably now discernible across the interdisciplinary field of Irish studies. And it further demonstrates how the acknowledgement and study of such trauma cannot be neatly presented as a voyeuristic description of pathologies or through the lens of pathos alone. I would argue that an understanding of the social and cultural structures that frame and underpin how trauma is actively produced and is an outcome of different types of wars, including small, but notably bitter conflicts, such as the Irish Civil War, is also important. The scale of expansive front battles have been non-existent, I was going to say small, non-existent in the Irish case, but the depth of bitter feelings, hurt, and pain in such a small, predominantly rural society, which is was premised on family and community values, can only have been deep-seated. And there are a lot of studies, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, anthropological studies on the nature of society at that time, small, familial, and predominantly rural. So any trauma, consideration of the texture of social and cultural life is as important as gunfire in engendering a broad and more sociological understanding of the impact of the Civil War at the time and in the intergenerational decades that followed. Any trauma by women experienced in the Civil War was, of course, compounded, as I said, by the dominant ideologies and patriarchal choices made by the new state's political leaders. And in fact, I'm not going to have time to go into this today, we alluded to it earlier, but I would argue that the evidence of misogynistic and patriarchal assumptions that framed women's lives were already long evident both before and during the Civil War, and that this was especially reflected in attitudes to violence against women in the Civil War. So I'm going to finish with that case study. I don't know how much time I have left. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to talk about this case in Mayo, and I don't have a huge amount of time, but I shall do my best. And I just want to say that, I do talk about sexual violence and always say if anyone is impacted by these questions, to please do access the supports, the rape crisis supports that are available, because we're not talking about something that's in the past. We are talking about something that's very much part of contemporary society and contemporary wars and conflicts. So rape in particular is one of the most devastating forms of violence associated with war. Again, I don't need to go through this really with you, but what we see happening to women and young girls in Ukraine, for instance, today, is what Alexievich has referred to as the unwomanly face of war. And I've looked at that in relation to other civil wars, the Greek Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, the revolution in Algeria, First World War, Second World War. There's a whole range of ways which you can compare these questions in Ireland. So a key issue has played on my mind, I suppose, as a scholar. And as I said earlier, if in a moment of national commemoration we can't think about this, how can we address these issues meaningfully in the present? Gender-based violence is an insidious aspect of everyday violence in all societies. We see it in reports every day. But is there any reason, I suppose, to believe Ireland's wars were any different to other civil and guerrilla wars of similar scale? And this is a question that's been ongoing, discussed, and I suppose what I've written elsewhere, I have looked at 9 cases in relation to the Civil War, and I have documented those in Women's History Review and in other publications. So I want to talk a little bit about Margaret Doherty, and I'll finish on this because it's just one case in microhistory. And so in 2018, I was giving a paper in Trinity College and to mark the retirement of David Fitzpatrick, whose work I had been quite critical of on war and terror for ignoring the violence the war and terror women experienced in lots of ways, but in relation to the content of the edited volume, there was no reference to this, and also there were actually very few women included in the volume itself as scholars. But I was still invited to speak at his retirement, which is probably a sign of the bigger person Fitzpatrick was. And literally the night before, I came across a pension application, which was highly unusual. It had just been released, and that was by an application by Catherine Doherty, Wexford County Mayo, Conor, on behalf of her daughter, Margaret Doherty, known as Maggie, to the family. And it's really unusual, and I suppose this is what I mean by micro-histories. There are not many of these kinds of files. And again, just cutting a very long story short, I've written about this elsewhere. So she described, she's applying for a pension in 1935, premised on the loss of her daughter Maggie. Again, long story, big file, but essentially she documents that her daughter was gang raped in May 1923 in Wexford, and by members of the Free State Army. And it's an extraordinary file because there's a lot of support. This is what I mean by the ethnographic context. There's letters of support from the parish priest, the Church of Ireland director, the doctors. There's obviously extraordinary sympathy and support for this family in a very small rural community. It also documents how Maggie, who was a member of Cumann na mBan in Wexford, along with a whole bunch of other women who were listed in other files, died in 1928 in the mental home in Castlebar. And so this is an example of the hidden injuries of the revolution. Maggie didn't die in a battle in 1922 or 1923. She died as a consequence of the injuries to her. And those injuries were predominantly psychological injuries. She was physically injured very badly as well, and I tend not to go through that evidence in public talks because it is traumatizing to read in some senses, but she was very badly injured. A reference was made in the application to a trial, and there, in Wexford, which was inaccurate because there was some kind of quasi get-together investigation that happened in Wexford. But actually what transpired over time was that there was actually a court-martial in Ballina courthouse of the 3 officers alleged to have conducted this. And after, I suppose, a long time of both the family getting in contact with me and also communicating with the military archives, etc., it became apparent that a file, an A-series file, did exist on this, but it was lost. And so after much toing and froing and letters, and probably me being a bit of a pain, the file was found, and I did seek political pressure. I did all of that. And I suppose the reason I'm telling you this is because you really do have to advocate for certain archives and files to be made available and to be seen. The family have subsequently given permission for this file to be open, and it is open. So I'm just going to finish in the last bit by reading a couple of things from that, and then I'll conclude. And this, again, I suppose what was most surprising when we went to look at this file, well, there were two surprising things, but I'll tell you about the other one later. But one of them was, I think, that the personal testimony of Maggie Doherty was very detailed and very powerful. So that was one thing. So the trial took place July 1923. As I said, there'd been the pension application. The case was also discussed in the 1924 Army Inquiry Committee, and this is in the Mulcahy papers in UCD, Conor. But it wasn't clear it was the Doherty case, but it was called the Mayo case, and nobody was named. I have to say Tom Johnson, the Labour Party TD, also raised it in the Dáil. But there was more, for some reason, again, we can discuss this in the questions, there was a lot more public emphasis on the Kenmare incident. But actually the Mayo case and the Kenmare incident, which was another attack on 2 women, are actually very much linked in my work, because they were National Army state violence, gender-based violence against women. And they were dealt with by the same actors at the top level of the executive. So these cases went right to the top. And there was an element of show trial involved, because when you look at the correspondence, you can see that the army, absolutely, and the top level of government, whereas there was different levels of sympathy towards what happened to the women, they presumed from the very start that there was no way any of these soldiers would be prosecuted. In fact, it was explicitly stated that they would have to be seen to have a trial in order to be seen to be doing the right thing, if that makes sense. So Maggie and all her family were called to this trial. The first witness was a Dr. Francis Keane from Ballina, sworn in, and he states, Miss Margaret Doherty came to me on the 30th of May last. She made a statement to me, I examined her. In my opinion, she met with considerable violence. I'm giving you the edited version. The injury showed signs of having been committed within some days, certainly within a week of the 30th of May. I carried out the examination in the presence of the maternity nurse for the district. And you can imagine what a maternity nurse in a district would have seen at that time, including with other kinds of violence of this nature. But the second witness duly sworn in was Miss M. Doherty. And in her statement, she recalled, I remember the morning of the 27th of May last. I remember some armed men coming to my house. I was in bed at the time. It was about 2 and 3 a.m. old time. A tall man entered my room, fully masked. And just picking up on the one you put up there, Gemma, with the candlelight and not wanting the light. This is the exact same thing. The masking of men in relation to violence against women occurs across the board. I guess because there's a shame, I suppose, in perpetrating it and also not wanting to be identified. Anyway, he came over to the bed and presented a revolver at me and said, what are you? I said, I'm a Republican. The man placed the revolver on my breast and said, you're not a stater, are you? I said, no. He began to brandish the revolver and said several times, say what side you are with. You are not a stater. I said, I am with the government. And they go into this long-drawn thing about, again, you see a very complex view of republicanism that actually doesn't relate to the terms, the way we use these terms today. So it kind of ensues. Maggie's mother called her husband to come down to light the lamp. The tall man said, we don't want a light. We don't want to be known. The tall man left the room, and after some words in the kitchen with Maggie's father, they all left the house together. However, they came back in about a quarter of an hour and started knocking at the door very violently. So again, this is a testimony that goes on and on and on. Maggie testifies, my mother then asked me to come into her bed. We slept in the same room. I went into my mother's bed. My father opened the door, and I heard the same voice say, we are sent by Carthy to shoot your doctor. And I suppose, daughter, sorry. And I suppose the reason I'm going through this is just to give you the micro examples of how terrifying this was and the level of detail that exists around the kind of micro atrocities of this period. So I'll skip along. So there was a lot of stuff as well around the body and sexuality, which I find very interesting as well, about the way in which these three masked men spoke to Maggie. They were kind of in disguise as well. They weren't in uniform. They were wearing trench coats, and it wasn't obvious. But she recognized one of them, and she recognized the voice of one of them. So anyway, so she refused to go. So he said, "It's dark and we won't see you. Get dressed." And she said, "Even so, I'm not going." And with that, he entered the room. He came over to my mother's bed and placed a revolver to my breast and said, "Come out or I will shoot you." I said, "Shoot, I'm not leaving my bed." With that, he caught hold of her nightgown and tore it. My mother began to scream and my father was crying. My father told me to go out then and to see what he wanted me for. I got dressed and I went out. So that night, Maggie was taken down the road and subsequently reported being raped 3 times, twice by one of the men involved. On the 25th of July, 1923, 3 army lieutenants named in the file were found not guilty and, quote unquote, honourably acquitted. The extraordinary and moving story of Margaret Doherty, just one story, serves as a very powerful reminder of some of the hidden realities of the Irish Civil War. Maggie's story lived on quietly in the intergenerational memory of her family and community, while it remained submerged and hidden in state archives and official histories of the Civil War in Mayo for almost a century. Her death in 1928, as I said, was not recorded as one of the killings of the Civil War, but it was caused by its violence. As Maggie Doherty said in her first-hand testimony in Ballina Workhouse while being interrogated, and remember, you might ask, why was she being interrogated when clearly, she was the one, who was the victim in this case. So she was drawn into a court situation, which I know from reading around this case, that she found incredibly traumatizing and re-traumatizing, and didn't want to participate in it. So, as Maggie said in her testimony, any man who takes revenge on a sister is not much. The women of County Mayo clearly suffered on both sides of the Civil War. Perhaps, though, if we use Maggie Doherty's own words there in her testimony while being interrogated in Ballina Workhouse as a starting point to acknowledge the harm caused by conflict-related gender-based violence, perhaps then a new momentum to tackle and address the root causes and consequences of these crimes might emerge. And perhaps in the process, the state, the army, and the decade of centenaries might begin, before this year ends, to recommend an official mechanism to acknowledge the families of the women impacted by gender-based violence in the Irish Civil War, and indeed in all warfare. And final point, in the process of acknowledging that gender-based and sexual violence simply happened in the Irish Revolution, we might remind ourselves that these crimes should not be repeated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Our final speaker of today's conference is Dr. Andy Bielenberg. Andy is Senior Lecturer in Modern Irish History at the School of History in University College Cork. He teaches both Irish social and economic history as well as Irish industrial history. He has contributed chapters to the Atlas of the Irish Revolution and recently an interesting work showing the relevance of today's conference to contemporary works. He has published a chapter recently on comparing violence and economic dislocation in Ireland and Ukraine, 1914 to 23, in Ireland and Ukraine, studies in comparative imperial and national history. So Andy, you know.
Thanks, Conor, and thanks to Universities Ireland for the invitation and the great hospitality. It's good to be back in Belfast and to meet some familiar faces and indeed a few new ones also. Now, this paper is is based on the initial stages of a mapping project on fatalities in Munster during the Civil War, which I've embarked upon with John Dorney. There are a number of good reasons to take a Munster focus. Following the initial dramatic opening events of the Civil War in Dublin, the primary theatre of the conflict switched over to Munster, which was, of course, the major stronghold of the anti-treaty IRA who opposed the treaty. Now, at the outset, the anti-treaty IRA had considerable numerical advantages in terms of the number of troops, and it did not press home these advantages in Limerick, as initially there was a reluctance to fight former comrades. People were still thinking about trying to avoid the Civil War, including the leadership at the time. And this certainly had a debilitating effect in the early stages when they, in many ways, lost the initiative, precisely at the time when they had maximum advantage. And subsequently, suffering defeats in the battles for the cities of Limerick and Waterford, which fell into Free State hands by the 21st of July 1922. And many of the towns in between subsequently folded quickly as the National Army arrived. Basically, the anti-treaty IRA had no answer to the use of artillery, so they were unable to defend fixed positions in urban contexts. Defeated anti-treaty forces retreated southward from Limerick, resulting then in another period of confrontation around Kilmallock, Bruff and Brewery, where they made a more prolonged stand over 15 days or so, but ultimately with the same outcome. So County Limerick figured significantly in the opening phase, in which the anti-treaty leadership demonstrated a major lack of military initiative. Conversely, the superior military leadership deployed by the National Army began to surface in the so-called early conventional phase of the conflict. Emmett Dalton, probably their best field commander, planned and orchestrated a series of amphibious landings between Kerry and Cork, which opened up two fronts for the anti-treaty IRA, and they really struggled to cope with that. A considerable advantage of going by sea, which Eunan has referenced, was that this route could not be contested by the anti-treaty IRA until the point of landing. And since the choice of location and also the timing was in the hands of the National Army, the anti-treaty IRA were at major disadvantages in all of these landings in Munster. News of the landings immediately led many volunteers to return to defend their native counties, thus further weakening the position in South Limerick and North Cork, while they were simultaneously absent when the crucial landings took place. And when the National Army landed in Passage West in Cork Harbour, for example, in the dead of night, they totally surprised anti-treaty forces. Nonetheless, stout resistance was subsequently put up around Passage, Rochestown and Douglas, and this is effectively where the battle for Cork took place, the capital of the so-called Munster Republic. And having taken these places, it's noteworthy that the anti-treaty IRA did not even attempt to defend Cork City. Instead, they rapidly and chaotically evacuated the city, burning the various barracks before departure on the 9th of August 1922. And of course this was much to the relief of many of the citizens of the city, as it spared the city from the kind of despoilation witnessed in Dublin and the other towns like Limerick and Waterford. At this stage, the futility of resistance in urban contexts was apparent, and the decision, of course, also saved anti-treaty forces to fight another day in more favourable environments suited to both their resources and aptitudes. And of course, the Civil War was far from over at the end of this conventional phase. By the end of August 1922, even though the National Army had taken all of the major towns at this stage in Munster, the death of Michael Collins was a salutary reminder that they did not control the countryside. The anti-treaty IRA retreated to its rural strongholds, which the National Army were unable to clear. By September 1922, the National Army had insufficient soldiers to move from a defensive positions they'd taken up in these towns to an offensive one, and putting some of their detachments in a precarious situation. And some even fell to anti-treaty forces, most notably Kenmare in County Kerry on the 9th of September 1922, and this was not retaken again until December 1922. So in this environment, the anti-treaty IRA was free to prosecute its campaign of destruction, which focused predominantly on infrastructure and property to prevent the functioning of the state and the economy. It was in this context that Mulcahy and O'Higgins introduced the Emergency Powers Bill before the Dáil in late September 22 to enable the National Army to more easily confront this kind of resistance, providing the Army with the facility to impose the death penalty for a range of offences such as the possession of weapons, ammunition or explosives. And it took some time before these controversial legal powers were deployed. But in the meantime, the National Army in Kerry resorted to reprisal killings if any of their men were killed, in particular targeting prisoners. The Dublin Guard made up much of the National Army in Kerry, and its officer corps, drawn from Collins' squad, did not abandon its Assassin's Creed from the War of Independence, with extrajudicial executions becoming commonplace, more especially when Brigadier Paddy O'Daly became GOC for Kerry Command in January 1923. And under the new military laws passed, at least 77 were subsequently executed, but many more anti-treaty IRA were killed in what were effectively ad hoc extrajudicial killings, with many occurring in custody. Todd Andrews claimed that there were as many as 153 of these extrajudicial or unauthorised killings. And if this figure is accurate, it's not implausible that over 45% of the killings of the anti-treaty IRA, of their fatalities, were these unauthorised killings of people in custody. In this, I'm including the executions, the official executions. So that's a phenomenal figure. And some of the worst cases occurred in County Kerry in 1923, notably at Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge, and Bahas, where prisoners were collectively blown to pieces with mines. Anti-treaty Republicans, for their part, utilised trap mines, which resulted in some atrocious casualties on the National Army side also. This occurred, for example, at Carrigapuka near Macroom in County Cork, when a mine mortally wounded 7 National Army. A similar type of mine was later deployed at Knocknagoshel in County Kerry, which killed 5, and the reprisals resulting from these attacks really gave rise to Ballyseedy and Countess Bridge, which I've mentioned. And the National Army covered up these atrocities. Inquests in which a medical doctor checked the bodies where a person died in unclear circumstances, they were not carried out in the case of these mine explosions. County Kerry accounted for well over a third of these ad hoc executions, while Munster accounted for about half. By May 1923, anti-treaty Republicans were either scattered in jail or dead. Fatalities, notably executions, played a part in wearing down Republican morale. But the huge numbers incarcerated was probably a bigger factor in crushing anti-treaty resistance. They had alienated much of their support base at this stage through a campaign of destruction, which was particularly damaging to rural communities who struggled to get livestock to market or to access vital supplies of basic foodstuffs, which contributed, of course, to the food crisis alluded to by Noel in his paper. So food supply became a weapon of war on the anti-treaty side, adding to an existing problem in 1922. Civil law had effectively broken down, and the National Army was handed responsibility at a time when the state was not fully constituted from a legal perspective. And exceptional legal powers were vested in the army. Execution, official and unofficial, essentially became a weapon of war exercised through reprisals, counter-reprisals, etc., thinly dressed up as military justice. And this atrocious legal situation was justified on the grounds that it was absolutely necessary to achieve law and order and to secure the very survival of the state. It was certainly one of the most sordid chapters in the legal history of the state. The emerging new state was far more severe than the British regime had been, particularly with regard to executions, both official and unofficial, and the extent of incarceration. Due legal process was evidently not followed in much of this. So turning now to the initial results generated by this project, which has focused initially on combat fatalities. We have the map there of these are combat fatalities alone. They probably account for, I would think, we have 3 counties. We've done some work on civilians in 3 counties, Cork, Kerry and Limerick. And civilians, I would estimate, are pushing towards maybe less than 20% of fatalities. So civilian fatalities are much lower than during the War of Independence period from the work that Eunan has done. But the other thing that comes out from the work is that the geography of conflict, if we take death as a good indicator of violence, Cork, Kerry, and Tipperary account for over 77% of the fatalities. So it's quite geographically concentrated. The other counties, while Limerick was very important in the conventional stage, Limerick was effectively cleared by the National Army successfully, and there wasn't many more fatalities after the conventional phase. Clare and Waterford, between them, had a very low fatality. Only 9% of the Munster fatalities were in these two counties. So this gives you a broad idea of the geography. I'm not going to get down into the kind of differences within particular counties due to time. Now, another feature of the conflict in Munster worth noting from the data, which probably reflected wider national trends, was that the National Army suffered a higher share of fatalities relative to the National Army, relative to the anti-treaty side. And that raises questions with regard to, firstly, the quality of the data. There's an issue there. Maybe we're not yet getting the full picture with the anti-treaty IRA. There's more of them out there that we're not picking up from the sources we're using. But I would suspect that one of the factors was the nature of combat. This was a likely factor here. The side taking a more offensive strategy suffered higher casualty levels and was seemingly more willing to take military strategies which had a higher cost in terms of fatalities. So I think this was a factor, more especially if we take out those who were assassinated in custody. If it's as high as 45% and we take those out, then that balance becomes much bigger. So this is all fairly preliminary, but I'm just putting some of this out to you to share with you. Okay, so one of the themes of the conference that seems to have come up quite a lot is the 1922, the timing of things. And I just wanted to comment a little bit on that. Eunan's brought it up on his paper, and Schiefer earlier this morning. What happened in Belfast was largely over in terms of killing by the time the four courts happened, 28th of June 1922. Most of the killing in Belfast was before that. So that's one big difference in terms of timing. Secondly, as some of the speakers have pointed out very eloquently, Jim McDermott, most of the casualties, the fatalities in Belfast were civilians. So it's a very different pattern. It's not, doesn't seamlessly fit with what was going on south of the border. 80% plus of the fatalities were civilians. So that's a very different pattern than we witness south of the border, where the roles are reversed. There are much fewer civilians being killed. So we've got to ask ourselves why that is the case. And that might reveal some important differences between the conflict, between the two parts, between the north and the south. Finally, the higher level of anti-treaty fatalities in Kerry, by far the highest across Munster, requires explanation. Kerry had the highest level of fatalities on the anti-treaty side in absolute terms. This difference can be accounted for by the remarkably high level of extrajudicial executions in that county. And when we throw in a handful of executions These collectively accounted for in the region of 2/3 of all anti-treaty fatalities in Kerry. 2/3 were executed in these extrajudicial killings in custody and so forth. So most Kerry anti-treaty IRA were assassinated effectively, as opposed to being killed in combat. So the state, in achieving a monopoly of violence in Kerry, adopted a highly Machiavellian approach. The end, in other words, justified the means. And due legal process was simply not followed. This approach was backed at the top of the army and by the government, as it took the view there was no other way to win the Civil War, which needed to be won in a short time frame if the state could survive. So while incarceration was clearly critical, the extent of assassinations in custody in Munster, and particularly in Kerry, have probably been the standout features of the data so far. And I think we can see from the officer group in Munster, in the anti-treaty IRA who met in Munster, who met Lynch in Waterford at the end, towards the end of the Civil War, and they wanted to end the war. And they pointed out these high levels of fatalities and the assassinations, in addition to incarceration, as factors why they should stop. There was nothing further to be gained. And of course, Lynch, unfortunately, wanted to go on. But I think that shows that the strategy taken by the National Army was probably working. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I am conscious, just for anyone who is looking at transport timetables, it is 5:10, so don't feel you need to apologise if you do need to head to the end of the room. But we will take a few minutes for questions, because I do think there's some really interesting points that have been raised by all three papers there. So if there are any questions in the room, do please raise your hand in the usual manner. And if there are not, it might be something that we might... Oh, there is a question at the end there, yeah.
This question is addressed to Andy. Just my partner here mentioned this. Was there an inquiry? Was there an inquiry into these killings in custody? And if not, should there be one? Even now.
Well, thanks for the question. Yes. There was an inquiry, but it was very tightly controlled within the Army, kept within the Army, and it was bottled up. And the Free State was very good with controlling the media and controlling inquiries, like in the case that Linda talked about too. A lot of stuff was covered up, and so historians are beginning to uncover some of this now. There was the historian Dorothy McCardle, of course, did the famous work, The Tragedies of Kerry, and she documented some of this. And this is one of the few places where all this got out much more. And of course, that in Kerry, this really informed political debates in Kerry in particular. But more generally speaking, both the Army and the government got away with it, covered it up, and so it's the duty of historians now for us to uncover it in its entirety. We've got a bit of the story, but I think we haven't got the whole of the mood yet.
Yeah, and I think there was a question there from Emma, was there? No. Okay. Oh, yeah, question from Chief.
Because I know everyone wants to head, but just one for Linda and Gemma, and Andy, if you want to come in. But Linda, I suppose I was interested in what you said about there being a strong denial of the occurrence of sexual violence. And I was just wondering if you have any comments on how you've encountered maybe responses and reception to your own work, and Gemma as well. Has there been anything there? And I was interested too in what you said about the danger of sexual violence being used as maybe something to pepper a grand narrative or as a flourish. I suppose I'll have to go back and think myself and see if I can think of any examples of that. But I just wonder if you would, both Gemma and Linda, maybe Andy too, how would you recommend to historians who are writing, let's say, not to say the grand narratives, but are writing more general histories, how is the question of sexual violence interrogated into those mainstream histories, if you like? Have you any recommendations around the ethics of that, maybe?
Can you hear me? I think there are multiple layers to respond to that. I think in different ways, depending on who you're talking to at different times. I mean, the first principle for me is that if there are families still around and if they have an interest and give consent to these questions we looked at, for me that's the number one principle in terms of reception. So I'm more concerned about how my work ethically in speaking about these issues in a very open way, and I must say it took me a while to find the right even way to speak about this in public. It took a long time, and I sort of wrote my way out of it initially, if you know what I mean, rather than spoke about it. So I spent a lot of time writing about this. So to me, the first, there's an ethical question around families, neighbourhoods, communities who have a living memory and have intergenerational trauma. There's no doubt about it. But are, I suppose, in a way, intergenerationally, I think this generation are willing to ask questions that the previous generation couldn't or were not willing to. So that's the first thing I'd say. So I think that's really important. I think that's where you start in terms of reception, is how your work is impacting those emotional and psychological ideas of personhood, for me, is the most important place to start. But then secondly, there's lots of ways, I think, in terms, so it can be received very badly. That's the first thing. And that's very challenging, because the question you would often get is, well, how do you know that happened? Often I have to edit my response, because how I know is because I have evidence of the injuries, and the injuries of gang rape in particular are horrific. So you have to be very careful again that how you're using evidence is also not contributing to some kind of unethical re-traumatizing, because sexual violence is everywhere, in contemporary societies as well. So it's the reception is very challenging. But I think what has been, for me, what has really had an impact is the academic paper is fine, but the public work, particularly the stuff I've done in the Irish Times, has been, I think, very useful in terms of changing the narrative and creating, I suppose, even the fact that I've been asked to do this today, do you know what I mean? They're all, I suppose, so I'm interested in how these representations of these kinds of crimes are very much part of the present. That's really where I'm starting from. It just so happens that this case happened in the Civil War in Ireland, but I've also done a lot of research on rape crisis in the 1970s and the 1980s. I have done interviews in the first sexual assault unit in the Rotunda. So I'm probably perhaps associating or approaching it in a different way from a traditional historian. So it's an interdisciplinary, ethical, and really the principle of consent with those really directly impacted on it, I think, are very important. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It stands to me just to...
Sorry,
Gemma, apologies.
It was fine. I just wanted to answer Sharifa, because she always asks excellent questions. Yeah. There's a few things going on. There's the specific question of rape in war, which is we can look at. We need to be attuned to those wider theories. The work that international organisations do. So that's not to say we're privileging quantitative over qualitative, because your own work, Linda's, is so important in those micro-histories. But sometimes those theories and that comparison of figures do help us to reach some kind of understanding. So it's not shying away from that, even though it might seem unfeeling to sort of talk about numbers. Andy talks about numbers, counting deaths, counting these things. I suppose another thing is, thinking about gender not just as that specific question, as important as that is, but just normalising looking at half of the population in all topics. And that's something that's really changing over the last few years, which is great to see. But in my own teaching, I'm trying to think about that more because I look at the War of Independence, and I'm just talking about men all the time. And I think it was Linda in the Irish Times. It's like it's not just a war about men; it's a war of women as well. So it's like, what about the Solihull ambush? What about all the women who were involved in that? Looking at their testimonies, and I've not ever brought that into. I'm going to try and bring that into my seminar this year. So I suppose thinking about gender as a lens to look at everything and not just these very specific kind of atrocities. So it shouldn't be. It's difficult to talk about these things, so we have to take that approach that Linda talks about. But it shouldn't be controversial. It shouldn't be. We all talk about very difficult things. My own stuff on minorities and sectarianism. We shouldn't. We should be allowed to do it, even though it's hard.
Just your mic, and no, you've got that. That's it. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Just so everyone can hear you.
I agree. Yeah.
Sorry. Here we go. Very quickly, usually on these issues I defer to my wife, I have to say, but I find that's the most sensible course. But one point I would like to make, though, a serious point, is that I think it's very, the National Army and the archives, the military archives have done great work in all this. It's been very good. But I do think there is more stuff in that archive around this stuff which should be out there. And I think there's a little bit of a wariness of digging too far. So a lot of their records are off-site. But like, for example, all the records that could potentially touch on these issues like discipline, court martials, they should all be made available publicly now. And also, on my own area, anybody who died, who they have records of on both sides, not just they've done a good job in the National Army, but also on the anti-treaty side. Anybody who's died or been badly assaulted through violence or rape, or this stuff should be published, and that should be out there and made public at this stage. So I think historians need to push that agenda, and that would be helpful.
Yeah, just to say, on the grounds of sexual violence, so I do know that the military archives seek advice from a senior counsel, and sexual violence is one of the grounds on which a family member can indicate that they don't want a file to be made available. So it's not a complete, they do seek advice, sometimes with a view to keeping the file closed, depending on what's convenient. But there is a whole legal archives that I would love to see explored, and the military archives have, in a way, they're very open about that now. So that's yeah.
Thank you. It stands to me just to introduce Dr. Antony Soares, who's going to close the conference for me. Yeah, we'll stay put here.
Yes, thank you so much. Just on behalf of Universities Ireland, I'd like to thank all of today's speakers, also the committee that every year brings this conference together, the program together. Really grateful to all their hard work over the year. Next year, obviously, will be the last conference in this series. We'll see what happens after that, but in terms of this series, next year will be the last one. So apart from thanking the speakers, the committee that puts all of this together, I'd also like to thank especially Tricia, the Administrator of Universities Ireland, for all her sterling work in putting everything together. Thank you so much, Tricia. For the Moonlighting team, who have recorded all of this, so it will be available on the website, so you can watch every single presentation back at your leisure. So thank you so much to everyone, and I wish you all a pleasant evening, a great weekend, the rest of it, and safe journey home. Thank you very much.